Amish silence. Copyright 2015 by Samantha Price. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. Be strong and of a good courage, fear not, nor be afraid of them, for the Lord thy God he it is that doth go with thee, he will not fail thee nor forsake thee. Deuteronomy chapter 31 verse 6. The year is 1820. Dawn broke earlier than Esther would have liked. She snuggled down in her soft mattress covered by her feather-stuffed quilt. The night air was no doubt still chilly around the house, though the sun would soon warm the walls. Another 5 minutes went by and Esther was back to sleep, enjoying a dream that felt like love and hope. Unable to hear very well, Esther woke up most mornings by her mother Moira poking her head through the bedroom doorway telling her to wake, and this morning was no different. "Do you hear me? We're leaving soon." Even being hard of hearing, she heard her mother's voice loud and clear. Esther opened her eyes, saw her mother and mumbled something before rolling out of bed, resigned to the fact that the day had started, whether she liked it or not. "I'm up, I'm awake." Esther's morning routine had begun. She changed out of her cotton nightgown, pulled on a dress, and then dragged a brush through her long blonde hair. Once the brush ran freely through her hair without being stopped by knots, she tossed the brush on her bed. She wound her hair onto her head, secured it, and then tied on her white prayer cap. Lastly, she pulled a white apron around her waist before she padded barefoot down the wooden stairs. She joined her mother in the kitchen, and warmed herself by the large fireplace in the corner of the room that doubled as their stove. Her mother walked over and said, "There you are finally. I just didn't want to miss saying goodbye to you. William will be here any minute to collect us." "I don't want you to go," Esther said after she read her mother's lips and heard her faint voice. "It's what's best now that your father has hurt his back." Esther was at least grateful that they were letting her stay on in the house. Rubbing her eyes with the back of her hand, Esther said, "It will be so lonely here without you." I know, but you'll be fine. You've got your dog, Max, the other animals, and your garden to keep you busy. Your father has left a horse and buggy for your use, and you can come to William's place to visit us any time you like. You can come every day." Esther crinkled her nose. Her mother was speaking too quickly for her to follow. Her mother stepped closer. "I said, visit every day if you would like." "Ah." Esther nodded to show her mother she'd heard. Esther looked down at the floor, studying her bare toes sticking out from under her dress. At 25 years of age, she was more than capable of staying home alone. As her brother and sister were a good 12 and 14 years older, she was also accustomed to a fair amount of alone time. Since her hearing had been damaged years ago, she'd grown more used to being in her own company. There was something peaceful about spending time in her own head, observing nature in solitude, and not having to worry about keeping up with the tediousness of polite conversation. Esther was close to her mother and was sure that the rest of the family thought that she was favored, or at the very least, babied by her mother. Esther had never been alone in the house. She sat gazing at her cold feet, and wondering what it would be like sleeping tonight in the dark and waking of her own accord in the morning. "Good morning, Bumblebee." The booming voice of Esther's father, Tom, stopped Esther from staring at her toes and brought a smile to her face. "Are you all packed and ready to go, Dad?" He closed the lid on the last of their trunks and walked over and hugged her tenderly. "We are going to miss you, Bumblebee," he said into her ear. "Yeah, we are all ready." "I'll miss you too," she said quietly and barely heard her own voice. Her father smelled of hay, and the gentle warmth of his strong arms around her felt like home. Beyond being caring and nurturing parents, they were simply wonderful people, and Esther hoped that she could be as good as them one day. She also wanted a relationship like the two of them shared. Her mother and father were in love after all their years of marriage. Esther saw the tenderness in her parents' eyes when they looked at each other, and she knew their love was something special. The bark of Max, her feisty terrier with coarse fur and an energetic tail, drew Esther out of her father's embrace. The dog rushed toward Esther, and she felt a cool breeze, leading her to assume that someone had come into the house. Max mostly stayed outside the house and slept in the barn at night. "That must be William," she heard her mother say. William and his wife, Blythe, lived a few miles up the road closer towards town but farther from the river. It had been decided at a family meeting that Esther's parents should go and live with William and Blythe. Even Esther's older sister, Millie, had agreed that it was the best thing now that Tom had been injured and was growing frail. Esther stood up as William came into the kitchen. He tipped his hat in Esther's direction as he stooped to fit through the doorway. Esther smiled and waved at him, and then he walked up to her. "Blythe made me be sure to tell you to come to our house whenever you'd like. Our place is your place." "Thank you, William." Esther had always liked the good-natured Blythe very much. Blythe and William now had 7 children. It would be a much busier household now that her parents were going to be there too, but William's house was large and William had plans of extending it even further. Then there was a hustle and bustle as trunks were loaded into William's wagon. Last-minute instructions and reminders were given and hugs were shared. Before she knew it, Esther was standing on the porch alone waving goodbye as her parents crested the hill in William's wagon. They looked more like tiny ants than people, and then they passed out of view. She hugged her arms around herself and wondered how she would survive without her parents for companionship. "I'll just stay busy," she said to herself. "And so will you, Max," she added, leaning down to give Max a scratch behind his ears. "What would I do without Max and the animals? At least I'll have their company." She looked around for her cat, Shadow, who always disappeared when Max came near her. The pair of them had never gotten along. "Let's put some coffee on and wash up, and then it's off to the barn for both of us. Old Bess is going to need milking, and I know those chickens will have some eggs for us. We've got our work cut out for us today, boy. It's butter day, and we need to get to churning that butter or we'll never get done by dusk. Wouldn't hurt if we could do a bit of washing in the stream too, but maybe that'll have to wait until tomorrow." Max wagged his tail. With a last look in the direction of her parents, Esther returned to the house to start her day. "There's no point in being blue," she lectured herself. "We're going to stay busy, make the best of the situation, and enjoy the peace and quiet as best we can. Max and I will be just fine." Despite the newfound loneliness in her heart and the quietness around her, the days passed quietly, and Esther found she didn't mind the time alone. It was nice to be able to move about and run her day along her own timeline. She and Max fed the chickens and the livestock and milked the cow twice every day. When the night came, she would go inside the house, and Max would go to the barn where he slept. Max had to sleep in the barn because Shadow, the cat, considered the house to be her domain. Chapter 2. By whom also we have access by faith into this grace wherein we stand, and rejoice in hope of the glory of God. Romans chapter 5 verses 2-5. Esther's days continued much the same, until one evening she noticed that a storm was brewing. Darkness fell all around Esther like sheets of molasses, dense and thick. Esther pulled her wool cloak tightly around her and hurried away from the barn, trying to get back to the house. She knew it was late, but the sudden downpour of rain had made the sky darker than it would have been normally. She balanced a full pail of fresh milk in one hand, sloshing some on the dirt path in her haste. Esther didn't like nighttime at all. With her hearing loss, she'd grown to rely heavily on her sight. Now she tried to tune into the darkness around her, but her foot caught on a tree root and fell hard onto the ground. As her skirts flew up around her waist, milk spilled everywhere. With her tummy flat to the ground, Esther pounded her fist on the dirt. She picked herself up and grabbed her bucket to see if there was any milk left in the pail. There wasn't. Standing in the rain, she shook as much milk off her skirts as she could before she realized she was getting soaked through to the skin. She hurried under the cover of the porch, and before she opened the door she looked up at the dark clouds that were hiding the moon and the stars. The stars were Esther's favorite things in the world to look at, but tonight she'd have to go without gazing at them. Before she looked away though, a sparkle caught her eye. She gazed back at the sky and saw a cloud move, allowing her to see a welcome glimpse of a bright star. She studied the star and wondered what everything would look like from the sky above if she were up there looking down. Then a sudden gust of cold wind interrupted Esther's thoughts and made her hurry inside. Safe in the house, Esther bolted the door. She couldn't hear it lock into place, so she did what she usually did after sliding the heavy iron bolt through the lock. She leaned over and looked at eye level to make sure the lock had completely engaged. William had insisted that she keep the door locked, and that was something that the family had never done. They'd all felt safe in the midst of the Amish farming lands. Satisfied that she was safe, she turned to survey the room around her, struck as usual by the sheer emptiness of the space. A main room in the center of the home doubled as both sitting room and living room. The kitchen led off from the living room, and including the utility room, which was the largest room in the house. The wooden stairs led up to 5 bedrooms. A wood-burning stove with a copper cooking plate on top kept her warm. Even though the house was empty, there were plenty of memories. Her brother and sister had left the home so long ago to get married that Esther only held vague recollections of them living there, but she had plenty of memories of them visiting with their young families. It seemed like only yesterday that the house her father Tom had lovingly built for her mother Moira had bustled with life. Esther made sure there was plenty of wood on the fire to keep it going while she went upstairs to change for bed. She exchanged her dress for a long cotton nightgown and then wrapped herself in a thick dressing gown. After pulling on some woolen socks, she headed back down the stairs. Esther settled into a chair while she waited for her soup and bread to heat over the fire. Without the distraction of talking to her parents, her gaze wandered the room and then settled on a worn blanket draped over the chair across the way from her. Brown with stripes of blue, the woolen blanket had been in their home for as long as she could remember. It was the blanket she'd laid under on the floor of the house, next to the fireplace, when she was 8. Her mother had spooned broth through her cracked lips and encouraged her to take small sips of water, while for days too numerous to count, as she had grappled with a fever. Yellow fever, the town doctor had called it. She had never heard of it before, but she was soon to learn that it had robbed her of the majority of her hearing. The doctor had told her parents it was a disease that had spread on the ships coming into America, carried to the farmlands by insects, possibly mosquitoes. After days of fever, and after giving her family quite the scare, she'd turned a corner. After a night of sweating, chills and heat waves, her fever had broken and healing had begun. Only she never healed completely. The last clear words she had recalled before yellow fever took her hearing were those of her mother, urging her to drink more water. "Try, sweetheart, try. Take a sip, my baby," her mother had said, and then the world had gone quiet. She wasn't completely deaf, but the noises she heard were faint and muffled at best. Being almost stone deaf had been something she had needed to get used to, but Esther and her family had been optimistic. She'd waited several weeks, they all had, hoping her hearing would return. And when it hadn't, the family simply accepted that Esther was going to be without hearing the rest of her life, and they had all been correct. Her family came up with signs for common words and phrases that they could exchange so they could still communicate with her. Her mother had been a teacher, and she'd used those skills on Esther, teaching her patiently to read and to do math. Esther stretched out her legs, warming her sock-covered toes by the fire, enjoying some relaxation after a long day. As usual, Shadow was asleep by the fire. Esther always had to pull Shadow back away as her fur was always hot to touch, and Esther was scared the cat might get too hot. Shadow never liked to be moved. Esther touched her fur, and then pulled her back a few inches away from the fire. Shadow turned her head and glared at Esther before she moved a little and went back to sleep. As Esther stroked Shadow, she wondered whether this was all life had to offer a deaf girl such as her, days alone with no one to communicate with. Now that everyone had moved out of the house, she wouldn't have to go into town very often. If she had to go to the town store, she would make sure it was on a Tuesday, when she knew Mrs. Mitz would be the clerk. Mrs. Mitz always smiled so brightly at her, and never had trouble understanding the things Esther asked for. Life would be good on the farm by herself. There was the smell of spring grass down by the creek where she drew water and washed her clothing. The one thing missing in her life was a family of her own. If she had a husband, she would be able to go to sleep on the cold nights with her husband's warm arms wrapped around her. She gave a little laugh, which must have come out louder than she'd thought because the sleeping Shadow raised her head to give Esther a glare. "I'm sorry, Shadow, go back to sleep." Esther would have loved to be a wife, a mother, somebody's treasure, but alas, she had given up on this long ago. After all, what man could love a girl who couldn't hear his voice, who needed a special set of signs and gestures to be understood by her? It was too hopeless to even think of, so she tried not to. Instead, she spent her days taking care of her duties, enjoying the beauty of nature around her, and being a doting auntie to her nephews and nieces. During the days, Esther kept as busy as she could. But nights were the worst for being alone. When those stars twinkled at her, she often caught her breath as her heart pounded, and she felt the need to call out for love, acceptance, and understanding from the world around her. Esther's only comfort at night was Shadow. When the fire died down, Shadow would make her way to the next warmest spot in the house, which was Esther's bed. Esther was grateful for the company of her animals. Chapter 3. Blessed is the man that trusteth in the Lord, and whose hope the Lord is. Jeremiah chapter 17 verse 7. After Esther had cleaned her dishes, she got ready for bed by checking the door lock one more time. Even though she lived within the Amish community, mostly surrounded by kinfolk, her brother's words rang through her ears: anybody could come here with ill intent. Satisfied that the house was locked up tight for the night, she added another log to the fire and carried the kerosene lamp up the stairs to her bedroom. She poured some water from the jug next to her bed into a shallow bowl, and dampened a dainty cloth to wash her face and hands. She sat on her bed and asked God for protection for each of her family members by name and then for herself. She slid down between layers of quilts and shuddered at the chill that greeted her toes. "I'll just lie here a few minutes and my toes will warm up. I hope so, at least." The night was a cold one, what she would have given to have a warm man to cuddle up against. With a sigh, she rolled over and went to sleep. She didn't dream that night, but for a brief moment in the middle of the night she thought she might be having a nightmare. A small window next to her bed had let in some moonlight, but she awoke to see the light shifting. It was odd to her, and since her eyesight was a stronger sense to her given that her hearing was poor, she paid attention. The light danced across the window pane, flashes of brightness alternating with darkness. Lightning. Lightning and storms were not unusual, especially not in the summer months. It wasn't strange to have 2 storms a week sometimes. She always enjoyed waking up the morning after a storm to see everything refreshed and clean. But she felt somehow that this storm was different. Esther sat up and then leaned over to peer out the window. Drops of rain pelted the glass, and she desperately tried to hear it. She'd heard rain as a child as it pelted on the windows. Esther moved back slightly as the droplets were so large and violent she thought the window might break. She shivered and lowered herself back under the quilts to wait out the storm. She fell back to sleep, but she didn't stay asleep long. When she woke again a little later, the rain was still hitting the glass, and the light was still flickering with the lightning strikes, but something wasn't right. She could feel it. Every few minutes the house shook, and she knew she wasn't dreaming. Thunder. I can't hear it, but it's strong enough that I can feel it. She wondered about her cow and the rest of the livestock and whether they were safe. Had they grown fearful? The horse Brandy was in the barn, and as long as that was still standing, Max and Brandy would be fine and warm too. There was nothing she could do but wait out the storm. She sat up in bed, pulled the quilts around her light frame and watched the light dance across her window. She steadied herself when she felt the thunder's vibrations, and she mentally chastised herself for insisting that her family not sell the farm, instead allowing her to stay there alone. Instead of thinking fearful thoughts, she closed her eyes and made herself concentrate on something that made her happy: her parents' love story. Esther had heard their story many times. When her mother Moira was young, she had moved with her family from Switzerland to the United States, settling into the community where Tom lived. It had been love at first sight for Moira and Tom, but instead of getting married young as both her mother's sisters had, Moira eventually left to travel far away to Colson County to work there as a teacher, leaving Tom behind. Over the next few years, Moira had traveled back to her family for Christmas and community weddings. Then one day Tom made the 2-day journey to where Moira was working and asked her to marry him, telling her he wouldn't take no as an answer. Moira agreed to marry him and moved back home to Earl Town. Tom built the house there, and that's where they raised their family. Esther smiled as she recalled the story that she'd been told and told again. When the house shook once more, Esther's mind blocked out her fear again, and she thought more about her parents' early life. Esther's father had told her that he had cleared the land with his own 2 hands and used the timber from the land to build the house. He said that he'd poured all his love for Esther's mother into building this home for her. The story of her parents' love always sent tingles down Esther's spine, and more than that, their story gave her hope. Esther saw the tenderness in her father's eyes whenever he looked at her mother. She saw his care and concern for her, and she saw the way her mother lighted up whenever her father walked into the room. They adored each other, it was plain for anyone to see. Esther's mind drifted to how she was now alone. Even though Esther couldn't hear all that the family members talked about, she just knew that William had been pushing her parents to sell the house. She was a little surprised when she'd been allowed to stay, especially since she was staying there alone. No doubt her mother had a lot to do with that. Her mother never wanted Esther to be treated differently just because she had a hearing problem. She closed her eyes again and remembered William's words to her about staying on in the house. "Esther, you can't stay here alone. That, and what if something happens and you can't hear it? There's no one there to protect you if there's an attack or an intruder. It's simply not safe, Esther. William had taken over the role as the head of the family. At the end of a long conversation with their mother and father, William finally gave Esther a nod, telling her she could stay in the house. Now, with the storm raging outside, she wondered if that had been the right decision after all. The house rocked again as a streak of lighting flashed in the sky. Esther was certain that the earth was going to break open and swallow her and the house. She was glad she couldn't hear the thunder at full volume, since even the faint echoes that she felt more than heard were more than enough to scare her. Chapter 4. Fear thou not, for I am with thee, be not dismayed, for I am thy God, I will strengthen thee, yea, I will help thee. Yea, I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness. Isaiah chapter 41 verse 10. From William's house, Moira heard the wind and her thoughts immediately turned to Esther, her youngest. Esther was alone, and Moira was certain that Esther wouldn't be able to hear the storm. What if something happened to the house and Esther couldn't hear it? Lightning could strike and set the house on fire, and Esther wouldn't hear a thing. Moira nudged her husband in the ribs. I'm worried about Esther in the storm. Tom mumbled something but didn't move. Moira nudged him again. Wake up. Tom sat up. What is it? I'm worried about Esther, she's alone in the storm. She'll be okay. She'll sleep through the whole thing, and besides, that house is as solid as a rock. Tom lay back down and mumbled, I built it to stand against the storms that rage in these parts. Something nagged at Moira, making her feel that Esther was in danger, but then again Moira was always worried about Esther. Now Moira silently prayed for Esther's safety. Esther was a young girl alone, and if anything dangerous happened, she was disadvantaged due to her hearing loss. If only she was married, and had a husband to look after her. Even though Moira felt that was an impossible thing, she still prayed that Esther would find a good man. If only Esther would help herself in that regard and talk to more people. It'll only be through the grace of God that she'll find a man who wants to marry her. Listening to the sounds of the storm outside, Moira snuggled further under her quilt. She was mainly responsible for the fact that Esther was living alone in the family home. Yet Esther had assured them that she would be all right to live alone. Moira had respected Esther's wishes to stay there, only to allow Esther independence. Now Moira wished that her daughter were there in William's house. You're worrying about her again, aren't you? I can hear the wheels of your mind winding over. Tom rolled over to face her. Moira gave a giggle. I try not to worry. I try and leave my concerns with God, but this time I'm worried. I'll have William go and see her first thing in the morning. There's no point anyone going anywhere in this storm, it would be madness. Go back to sleep. Tom rolled back over and Moira tried her best to sleep. Just as Moira drifted off, a streak of lightning lit up the dark sky and the house shook from a thunderous roar. That was a bad one, Moira said when the house stopped shaking. Tom didn't answer, and soon after he snored. Living with William wasn't an ideal situation for Moira, but at nearly 70 years of age and with Tom's bad health, it was a situation that she'd had to come to terms with. She'd much prefer to be living back at their house where she'd raised their 3 children, in the house that Tom had built for her on the edge of his parents' land. The night passed slowly, but Esther held vigil, praying the house would still be standing when the storm had passed. When the sun finally rose, she was glad to see its bright rays. The light pierced the glass and she heard what she thought must be Henry the rooster crowing. Wrapping herself in a blanket, she stepped out of bed and proceeded down the stairs, desperate to rekindle the fire and put on the kettle for a hot cup of coffee. It had been a long night, and this day would seem even longer still. There would be a huge cleanup after a storm so large. Creeping down the stairs, she felt a draft. She recalled that she had checked the doors and windows before bed and all had been closed, so feeling a draft was a curiosity. And then she saw it. Stepping down onto the lower floor of the house, she felt the wind and the drizzle of rain still hanging in the air, and she caught her breath. The entire corner of her house, the corner encompassing the kitchen and the main fireplace, was entirely gone, ripped out, gutted. Esther let out a small breath, crossed her arms to shield herself from the chill, and then lowered herself to the ground in defeat. Her home was ruined, which meant her family would not allow her to stay on. She tried to be thankful to be alive, but a feeling of helplessness overwhelmed her. The home was her security, her haven. Where would she go now? Chapter 5. There hath no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted. Above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 13. Esther didn't know how long she sat there wrapped in a large rug on the log across from the front door of her house, with Max by her side. It could have been hours or perhaps only minutes, she wasn't sure. Lost in thought and exhausted from the night, Esther wasn't sure what to do next. She stared at the remnants of the storm's wrath, shaking her head and wondering again what she should do. She would have given anything for a hot mug of coffee and some breakfast, but she was too shaken by the storm to make the effort. The fireplace in the kitchen was destroyed, but she could still use the fireplace in the living room to boil the kettle, and she would be able to cook over it in a frying pan. She hoped that William would come soon to see how she'd fared in the storm. She didn't have long to wait before she saw a horse and rider heading toward her. It was William. He was reliable, and there was no doubt about that. Esther concluded that the roadways must have been chopped up by the storm for him to be riding his horse instead of driving his buggy. He gestured to her, asking if she was all right, using signs that they both knew. She gestured back. It took a few minutes of gesturing and signing and voicing a few words that Esther could hear, by reading lips, to understand that the storm had created a disaster area for the whole community. Both her brothers' and sisters' homes had suffered damage, and William wasn't surprised to see the damage to the old family home. It was bad, he said. Everyone has repairs to do today. We're blessed that it's going to be a day of the sun shining. William walked inside and inspected the damage. It's not too bad. It's just this one corner, isn't it? Yeah, that's all. Can you fix it? No, not quickly. I've got repairs at home, but I ran into Devon Hirschberger on my way here and he's got no damage at his house, so he offered to help me repair mine. I'll go ask him to do the repairs here, I'm sure he will. William told Esther more about the damage to everyone's homes, and about Devon Hirschberger, who would be coming to do the repairs on her home. The Hirschbergers had moved to the community 2 years ago, and apart from seeing them at the Sunday gatherings, Esther knew little about them. I don't have to leave, do I? Esther asked, pulling the rug around her tighter. William scratched his right temple. I'll fix up the other fire so you can boil water and cook on it. Then I guess there's no reason you can't stay here. The house won't fall down or anything. Unless you'd rather come back and stay with me. We'd be happy to have you. Esther shook her head. I'll stay, she said, grateful that he was giving her that option. She was unsettled that her house wouldn't be secure, but figured that no robbers would expect anything of value to be left in a damaged house. William strode around the house, walking from what was left of the kitchen to the living room. I'll have to make it secure for you, though. There's an old door out in the barn. I'll attach it to the bottom of the stairs. That way, the top level of the home where the bedrooms are will be secure. Esther nodded, grateful that he was looking after her and that he understood that she wouldn't want to leave the house. It took William a couple of hours to finish securing a door to the bottom of the stairs, and then he left her alone in the house. If Esther had felt alone before, she was even more alone now. William and her sister Millie had always been there to help her, but now they had to look after their own families. Seeing her house destroyed was anxiety-inducing enough, but now having a man she barely knew coming to the house made her anxious. Esther wondered how she would communicate with Devon. She'd never spoken to him before, although he seemed nice enough. Would Devon know that she wouldn't be able to hear him too well? What if he stared at her or talked to her and was surprised when she didn't talk back? What if she tried to say words and they came out sounding so strange that he thought her stupid? If I'm to live alone, I'll have to take on these responsibilities, she told herself, trying to make herself brave about talking to Devon. She only hoped he'd be able to understand what she said to him. She hurried to milk the cow and feed the rest of the animals. When she'd finished her chores, she set the fire in the living room alight with some wood that thankfully was dry since it had been stored in a basket in the utility room. She put water in the kettle to boil, and while she waited she warmed her hands by the fire. Finally the mug of coffee was in her hands and she sipped it, pleased to have something warm in her stomach. Now she'd have to do some cleaning up in the yard, and also pick up all of the fallen branches and twigs that littered the place. She set down her mug and pulled on her boots, ready to start getting some work done. When she wandered outside, Esther caught her reflection in a pool of water by the house, and allowed herself the luxury of looking into her own face for a time. She wondered what the visitor would think of her. Would he think her a beautiful girl, or a sad recluse who couldn't hear or speak properly? At closer to 30 years of age than 25, she wasn't looking old, not at all haggardly, but she was most definitely considered by the community as past her prime. She was way past the normal marrying age for girls. Her golden curls tried to escape her prayer cap even though she'd braided her locks tightly. There were still ringlets of hair that were wispy and defied being trapped under her cap. Her skin was clear and bright, healthy and ruddy. Her sparkling blue eyes were the color of summer skies. The day wore on, and Esther spent her time clearing the debris from the storm and tidying up in general. Just as she was about to take a rest, she caught sight of a horse and rider. She looked hard and saw that it was Devon. Esther's fingertips flew to her throat. Her brother had said that Devon was coming tomorrow, not today. She looked a mess and was not at all prepared for visitors. Yet he would have seen her already, so it was too late to run inside to clean up. She stayed still and watched him get closer. The nearer he came, the clearer his tall, steady frame became. Devon dismounted and tipped his hat. She watched his mouth forming the words, "Hello there." She walked to him, smiled and extended her hand. She tried to say the words, "Hello, Devon," but was not at all sure how well she did or how her speech sounded to him. Then she told him that she was Esther. She hoped she'd said it clearly. Her hand touched her chest as she said her name. A grin broke out on his face, and for a moment she was sure he was going to laugh at her, but he didn't. Instead he said, "I know who you are, Esther." Then he tipped his hat again, and gestured with his hand towards the house, indicating that she should show him the damage. The two walked quietly, side by side. Esther's heart pounded with worry, but Devon seemed kind and he'd been perfectly polite. While Devon studied the damage to the house, Esther couldn't help but study him. She was sure she could tell what type of man he was from his kind eyes. From her observations she gleaned that he was around 6 feet 2 inches tall, his hair was sandy and his eyes blue. After looking at the house, Devon said, "I should check the barn." Esther nodded and followed him to the barn. Either he'd been told that Esther couldn't hear, or he'd guessed that she couldn't because he was speaking loudly. They walked around the barn, and seeing that it was okay, they continued walking down to the creek. Esther didn't know why he led her there since there were no structures down by the water. He admired the cow and commented on the garden. She even caught a few words of him saying what a shame her extensive vegetable garden had been ruined by the storm. Esther only understood parts of what he said, but she liked that he was trying to talk to her even when he knew it would be difficult for her to understand him. An hour later, Devon mounted his horse and tipped his hat to her, a smile on his handsome face. Esther hoped that Devon would be back the next day too, but of course that would most likely be up to William to arrange, since he made all the decisions regarding the house. Esther stood in front of her weather-beaten house and watched Devon ride away. She hadn't been timid with him, like she had been certain she would be. He was nice. Chapter 6. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Matthew chapter 11 verse 28. Esther didn't have long to wait to see Devon again, as he was back the next day. "I start work today," he told her. "Good," Esther said, sure she was blushing. Esther kept herself busy while Devon began his work. Even with her vegetable garden ruined, and her cooking limited to the small amount she could do over the small fire in the living room, there was still plenty of work to be done. She fed the animals, did the washing, and made sure she kept out of his way for a good time. Esther was pleasantly surprised when she returned to the house to find Devon waiting there. He'd made a pot of coffee, and it was sitting on the living room table with a mug set aside just for her. "Thought you could use it," he explained with a grin. "I hope you don't mind that I helped myself." Her brow furrowed a little, and then she smiled at the offered mug. "Thank you. It'll take a few days to get all of the repairs done, but I can manage them easily enough. Might need your help a time or two though." Esther nodded along until the end when the words got a bit muddled. "Sorry, I didn't catch that last part." "Which part?" Devon was silent for a second. "I might need your help a time or two," he repeated. "I'll be happy to help. She smiled brilliantly and sipped her coffee while her gaze briefly wandered from Devon into the kitchen. She hoped he wouldn't want her to do any heavy work. Remembering that she couldn't even drive a nail straight, she said, "But I'm busy a lot, so I don't know if you'll be able to rely on me quite so much." Devon laughed. "Of course. I understand. But so long as you can make the coffee, I think that'll be help enough." She paused, and then felt heat rise in her cheeks as she saw the way he stared at her. It wasn't the way other people had looked at her. "I see, of course. Well, I live here, so that part won't be a problem," she added, hoping he'd stop staring at her. "I guess I'll just have to make sure there's plenty of coffee too." She hoped she was responding to him accurately. That was the problem with being deaf. She never knew if she heard what was said, and most of the time she was guessing. "Sounds good to me. I'll get started in earnest tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, Miss Esther." "Enjoy yours too, Devon. See you tomorrow, Can't think of anywhere better to be." He left, and Esther settled in her chair with her thoughts that swirled slowly around everything and nothing all at once. Did he say he couldn't think of anywhere better to be? Neither could she. She was pleased to have his company. He didn't seem to judge her or get irritated when he had to repeat his words. Esther couldn't bear to think about the costs of the repairs or about who was going to pay for them. That she liked Devon couldn't be denied, but she wasn't entirely sure if he liked her back. Yet he had been staring at her as if he liked what he saw. A flood of well-being swept through Esther's body, and for the first time she knew that she would be able to find love. If he didn't like you, she thought, then why would he want to linger long enough for a chat and coffee? It was sound logic, and that logic carried her through the evening. When she went to bed, it was with a glad heart and a flutter deep in her belly. The next day, Devon came by early, just after daybreak. Esther had only just finished milking the cow. "Hello, Devon." He tipped his hat and smiled. "You're early, aren't you?" she asked, wondering if she should expect him so early every day. "I've a lot to do," she heard him say clearly. "Would you like a cup of coffee before you start? I just boiled the kettle before I came outside." "I'd love a cup." Devon followed Esther into the house. Over their coffee, they managed to communicate about the weather, her family, and his family. As soon as he drained his cup, he told Esther he'd better get started. Things were getting back to normal at Esther's house. The chickens were calmer, the goats and cow were the same. She checked up on her vegetable garden and saw to some of the weeding too while she was at it. Some things were good to harvest, so she did, satisfied that she'd have more fresh vegetables to prepare for lunch and supper. She returned to the house and started to prepare things for the midday meal. She was certain that Devon would have worked up an appetite. A few hours on, Devon poked his head into the kitchen and asked, "Is that fresh coffee I smell?" Esther half turned to look at him with confusion. "Sorry, I didn't hear." Devon nodded and grinned lopsidedly at her. "Coffee?" "Oh. I just made it," she said. "It's as fresh as it can be." "Ah, good. Mind if I have a mug?" "Not at all. You might as well wait here, I've nearly finished the meal." She slid a mug his way and went back to making a light salad and a couple of sandwiches for lunch. They didn't talk at all for a long time while they ate, but no sooner had they finished than they were back to talking. He told her how far the repairs had come. She talked a bit about the animals and how well they were faring. "Come talk to me while I work," Devon said. "I'd love to stay and sit, but I must keep going." Esther was happy to do that. She followed him outside, and while he worked she chattered away to him as if he were a close friend. He worked until dark, and Esther asked him to stay for dinner. Over dinner, Devon asked, "How did you lose your hearing, Esther?" She swallowed hard and looked across the table at him. "I was young," she finally said. "And I got sick. It was yellow fever, which many people die from, but I guess God had his reasons for keeping me here." Devon pulled a face and nodded as though he was deep in thought. "Your hearing doesn't seem all that bad. I mean, I don't have to yell for you to hear me or anything like that." "It's bad enough. You speak a lot clearer than most, that's why I can hear you better." Esther's mouth pulled to one side. "It helps if I stand directly in front of someone too, so I can see the way their lips move and the expression on their face." "Does your hearing stop you doing things?" I don't see you at any of the Sunday singings, or at any of the events. I keep to myself. I stay home, mostly because people treat me differently. Sometimes if I have to ask a person to repeat their words, they think it means that I'm dumb or stupid. It's the worst feeling. Even my family does it from time to time. I know they're well-meaning, but I can see them roll their eyes at me. It's not as if I can help it. My sister told me it took too much effort to keep repeating everything she said, and that's why she's impatient with me. Esther pouted her lips. Devon pressed a hand to her shoulder and leveled his gaze with hers. His expression was a somber one as he replied, "You're not dumb at all, Esther. Anyone who makes you feel like that is a rare kind of fool. And you're right, you can't help it if you can't hear." "Not so rare," Esther replied with a twist of her mouth. "Thank you. Have you been to a doctor about it? I mean, since the illness and all?" Esther pulled a face. "I went a while ago, but he just wanted to give me those ear horns. Hearing aids, they call them." "Is something wrong with them? I mean, do you not like them, or don't they work, or what?" She furrowed her brow as she struggled through some of his words. Devon repeated, "Do they, or did they work?" Oh yeah, they work, but I'd rather not have to carry one around when I don't need it all that often. They're not cheap either. It just seems silly to spend so much money on something like that." Esther shrugged. "I haven't been back to a doctor since I was a child. Maybe you should see one again." Devon took a sip from his mug, grimaced, and refilled it to warm it up. "Who knows? Maybe they've figured out a new treatment, or maybe the ear horns are cheaper now. You won't know until you go and ask." "I suppose I could," she said after a long moment. I don't know. I'm a little worried, that's all." "About what?" "I don't know," Esther said. "Losing more of my hearing, or spending money on something I don't really need, or well, I guess it's hard to explain. Sometimes it's just easier not to think about things." Devon shook his head. "No. I understand, I think. All the same, I'd like it if you'd go. I'll even pay for it." "What?" "I'll pay for your visit to the doctor." Esther laughed and shook her head. "No, I was just surprised that you'd offer such a thing. If that's the case, I'll go. But don't get your hopes up." "Fair deal. I'll take you there myself if you'll allow me." Esther smiled and nodded. "Thank you so much, Devon." Devon wanted to help Esther wash the dishes and clean up, but Esther insisted that he go home. She walked him to the door and he turned around and smiled at her. "I'll see you tomorrow." Esther nodded and stood there and watched him jump on his horse. He had no saddle, just a bridle. She wasn't sure exactly where he lived, but she knew it wasn't too far away. She remembered that he had some brothers and sisters who were younger, and she knew his mother and father by sight, although she'd never spoken to them. She closed the door and cleared away the dishes, washing them in a bucket of water near the back door. When Devon came back the next day, they followed the same pattern, with Esther trailing Devon as they talked. It was a refreshing change from everything she was accustomed to, and deep down she worried that when the work was done she'd lose his friendship. She'd never had a friend like him. Chapter 7. And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee. For my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly therefore will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verses 9 to 10. It wasn't until the next week that they were able to visit Dr. Schaefer. Esther wrung her hands and fretted over the whole ordeal, but Devon reassured her that everything was going to be okay. I'm still not sure if this is a good idea, she murmured. It'll be fine. The worst that happens is he tells you there's nothing they can do. Devon flashed a smile at her. Just trust in him. He's the best doctor I know. I'll bet he's the only doctor you know. Esther giggled, and then hoped she'd heard him correctly, or she'd be giggling at her own imagination. That's true, he joked, but that's what makes him the best. Dr. Schaefer poked his head out of his examination room, and motioned for them to enter. Let's take a look-see and figure out what's amiss, shall we? Esther nodded and stepped into the room with Devon following. Just take a seat now. What happened to cause the hearing loss? Even though his words were loud, they weren't clear. Esther frowned and looked at Devon, who repeated what the doctor had just said. I was sick as a child of roughly 6 years old. I got a nasty headache and fever, and it got worse after that. The doctor told my family later that he thinks it was yellow fever. There was an outbreak in the area, but I was the only one in my family who was affected. That was when my hearing got worse. When I got better, I couldn't hear as well as I used to. I see. The doctor shuffled about the room and set up a tray with various implements, including a device that looked like something out of a bad dream. This device was lifted, examined, and eventually carried to where she was. What's that? It's an otoscope. It'll let me get a good look into your ears to see what sort of damage is there, the doctor explained. A what? An otoscope. The doctor chuffed and placed the conical piece into her ear to peer into it. He squinted at the lens and chuffed to himself again. Esther lapsed into an uncomfortable silence while he made a plethora of strange and thoughtful sounds to himself. Dr. Schaefer shifted to check the other side, this time with an audible clicking of his tongue and yet another round of thoughtful noises. When he finished, he settled in to jot down some notes. Well, was all he said for some time. Well? Devon asked. Well? The doctor put the otoscope down and reached for a tuning fork. Hold your head still, please. Now I'll ring this fork twice and you tell me which is the loudest. Understand? Esther nodded. I understand. Good. What followed was a strange battery of her hearing, as tuning forks were rung and held next to her ear or away from it. One was placed in the middle of her forehead, then over her upper lip, then over her head. For the next half hour, the doctor asked Esther a series of questions about the volume of the forks. Esther offered yes and no answers, with the occasional request to do the test again. By the time he was done, her ears were ringing on their own, and she rubbed behind one ear with a grimace. Dr. Schaefer made his notes in silence. He chuffed and grunted his way along while Devon shot Esther a sidelong look with a raised eyebrow. She shook her head with a half smile, and worried her lower lip with her teeth while she waited. Well, I'll send these results off to a colleague of mine, he said. He might be able to do something for you, but we won't know for a few weeks. He might want to take a look at you too, just to make sure. He jotted a few more things down, and then rubbed the back of his neck. We'll have to see. That's all I can tell you right now. Thank you, Dr. Schaefer, Devon said. What happens now? Esther looked at the doctor and then looked at Devon. Devon leaned closer to her. The doctor will send the test results to a colleague of his, and then he'll contact us. I see. Esther was disappointed that she wouldn't learn anything there and then. Even though she hadn't been too keen on the idea of going to see the doctor at first, she'd grown hopeful that something might be able to be done about her hearing loss. Devon stood up and held Esther's arm, telling her it was time to go. Thank you, doctor, Esther said before she rose to her feet. The doctor huffed a bit. No trouble at all. I'll send a letter to you when I hear back from Dr. Kaufman. I will no doubt see you again after that time. Yes, thank you. Esther ducked out, and Devon followed with a hand pressed lightly to the small of her back. It sounds good to me, Devon said once they were outside. It didn't sound like anything at all. Why couldn't he tell me if he could do anything? He has to hear back from someone else, Devon said. He wouldn't want to tell you something unless he was certain. He's just being careful. Her expression soured, and Devon's hand lifted to her shoulder to give it a squeeze. It'll work out, I'm sure of it, Devon said. They were silent for the ride home, while Esther thought the whole thing over. The examination was bad enough. The idea that she might have to do it again was even worse. All the same, she had no choice and she knew it. If there was a chance at fixing the problem, she had to try. When they got back to Esther's house, Esther saw that William was there. He stood on the porch with arms crossed and waited for them. When Devon pulled up the buggy, Esther called, "What are you doing here, William?" "I've been worried out of my mind." "Where have you been?" William called back. Esther's mouth pressed into a flat line and she glowered at him. He was treating her like a child in front of Devon, the man she wanted to impress. "I think she meant why are you here," Devon said after glancing at Esther. "Where did you take Esther?" William asked Devon, walking quickly toward them. You've got no business to take her anywhere at all. You're only here to do the building work. I just took her to a doctor to look at her ears, Devon said. I'm the person who looks after my sister, not you. You have no business taking her to the doctor. I'll look after my sister and she's seen a doctor. Who are you to tell me whose business it is? Devon said, jumping down from his wagon. William squared his shoulders. I'm her brother. You're just here to fix the house. Understand? That's what you were hired to do. Fix the house. He pointed at Esther. You're not here to fix her too. Devon held up his hands in a placating gesture, but Esther could sense his desire to roll his eyes. I'm sorry for my heated words before. I understand that I might have overstepped my boundaries, although Esther isn't a child. Why do you treat her like one? Esther said, Stop it, both of you. Devon immediately said, Fine. No more doctor's visits. He glared at William. Are you happy? No, I'm not happy that I let you come here. You need to leave now, William said, taking hold of Esther's hand. Perhaps you should go, William, Esther said. I'm very tired, and there's still a lot to be done here. He's the one who should go, William snapped. He's the one to blame for you not being able to get the work done. I can help you out with what still needs to be done around here today. And then I'll tend the repairs myself. No, both of you should go, Esther said. William, you should go, and Devon will go home when he finishes his work on the house today. William glared at Esther. You have a lot of duties, William, but treating me as a child isn't one of them. William gnashed his teeth as he continued to glare at Esther, then at Devon. If I see you again, he said to Devon, I'd better see you hammering away on those repairs. If I see you anywhere else with her. Right, I understand, Devon replied. His expression was dark and displeased, but there was nothing to be done about it. William left, leaving Devon and Esther alone. Thank you for your help, she finally said. And I'm sorry that he's like that. He's always been my fiercest protector. Seems like he's also the one who trusts your judgment the least, he noted. Esther sighed heavily. Doesn't matter now, does it? We'll find out what the doctor says and go from there. Devon opened his mouth to say more, only to shut it a moment later. He nodded once, then turned on his heel and headed to where he kept his tools. I've a little more to do today. If you need me, you know where to find me. Thank you, Esther said and watched him as he rounded the corner to get to work. She sighed again and went to get the egg basket. Thus did her day begin, if rather later than she would have liked. Though she saw to the cow and goats before the doctor's visit, there was still plenty to do. By the time she was done, she saw that Devon had left at some point without letting her know. She sat in her kitchen, which was nearly back to normal, and nursed a glass of milk. Her thoughts turned to all the conversations she'd had with Devon, then went to the conversation between her brother and him. Esther grimaced and finished off the milk. Was Devon right? She couldn't be sure. William always seemed to be so impatient with her, and she couldn't be sure if it was because of her disability or just because she was his sister. Sometimes she feared that he viewed her as stupid, and everything seemed to point to that being true. How could William object to Devon caring about her hearing? Chapter 8. Be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart. All ye that hope in the Lord. Psalms 31-24. Esther held the cup with the steaming tea inside. She enjoyed the warm waves flowing through her fingers, up into her arms. Somehow she'd carry on and manage as she always had. God always helped her through all the hard times, and he'd help her through this one. William had appointed a new builder, Joshua King. William had explained to Esther he'd had another talk with Devon, and the two didn't see eye to eye on a few things. Esther was glad she wasn't a witness to that exchange. The first argument both men had been bad enough. William had gone on to tell Esther that Devon was only interested in a girl who wasn't damaged, and that was the only reason he'd cared about her hearing. Esther doubted that was true, but she knew from the sincerity in William's eyes that he believed it to be a fact. Esther finished her tea, and then poured a cup to take out to Joshua. Taking care not to spill the contents of the cup, she walked steadily through the kitchen door and up the path into the yard. Large stones had been laid there as stepping stones by her father when he'd first built the house. Esther navigated them, jumping with tiny steps from one rock to the other. She examined the destroyed corner of the house to see it taking shape. A cold breeze raised the hair on the back of her neck, as the wind chased low gray clouds drifting above the property. The heavy knocks of the builder's hammer greeted her, and reminded her she wasn't alone. If the house could be repaired, maybe her life could be repaired as well. Joshua gave a smile in her direction, and he hit once more with the hammer before putting it down and stretching his arms theatrically. Esther approached him and offered him the cup with a timid smile. "May the good Lord bless you for your kindness." "I was just about turning real thirsty," he said, while he took the cup and lifted it to his mouth. He took a good mouthful before Esther could warn him that it was extremely hot. She had taken the pot off the fire only a moment ago. But the carpenter didn't seem to mind. He must have a throat made of iron. Joshua took another large mouthful, snapping his tongue in satisfaction after half emptying the cup. "That's a good one. Warming up the man working hard, warming up from the inside. A little whiskey could not hurt it, though." He laughed. "But it's a fine cup of hot tea nonetheless." "Thank you, Esther." Esther looked down at her feet and took a small bow. She heard him mention whiskey and wasn't sure why. Maybe he'd said that whiskey warms him up on a cold night as well as hot tea warms him. "It's going to be nicer than ever, Esther, ain't it?" Joshua winked and nodded his head toward the building. Esther looked at him and scrunched up her nose. Joshua looked at the house. "Better than ever, I must say. Devon made a solid job with reinforcing the foundation." Esther nodded. "Indeed he did." She added after a short pause, "I'm glad you didn't mind taking up the job after Devon." "Well, there are some bits I would have done differently, but God made us all just similar to his own image, not exactly the same." "How boring would that be?" His mouth opened wide and he let out a laugh, which Esther heard loud and clear. Esther knew Joshua from the community, and he'd always been loud and full of energy. I wonder if he asked too much to complete the job. Strange that Devon stopped all of a sudden. Did William and he have a falling out? No. Esther bit her lip. I'm not sure what happened. He was working just fine though. I see. That's clear as daylight, Joshua said, eyeing the corner of the house he was working on. You know, Esther, I hope you understand the way I mean. I just can't see where he got it wrong. And I would not want to repeat his mistake, is all I'm saying. But just yet, I don't know how I could avoid it. Esther nodded quickly, taking half a step behind, avoiding Joshua's gaze. She wasn't certain what he was talking about. Maybe he thought that Devon had been let go for making some kind of mistake. You're doing a fine job, Joshua. I'm sure William will be pleased with your work. No need to worry. Joshua just looked at her for a few slow, unnerving seconds, then he finally shrugged. Well, I don't worry. Just wanting to be sure is all. Esther fiddled at her apron nervously. She did not want Devon to get into trouble. Her brother never gave an explanation to Joshua or anyone else about why Devon was replaced, and since Devon's rates were humble and his work was flawless, it certainly seemed to make Joshua wonder. And since Joshua had been given no reasonable explanation, chances are he might jump to conclusions. Esther did not know how gossip traveled within the community, she just knew that it did. Might I bring you another cup? I've got some left in the pot. The offer burst forth from Esther unexpectedly. She barely waited for the answer, grabbing the cup from Joshua, who looked at her with raised eyebrows. Yeah, if you're offering, he called after her as she was already halfway back to the kitchen. The kitchen was almost like a home inside her home. She could spend days without moving out of it. It was the easiest place to heat up. Esther quickly poured him another cup and took it out to Joshua. She told him to leave the cup out when he finished, and she'd collect it later. Joshua got back to hammering, whistling a merry tune along with the ever stronger gusts of wind. Esther hoped he had found the peace of mind to leave the matters of the previously contracted worker where they left it. She spilled the remaining hot water, filtering it through her own mix of tea leaves. She really wished this restoration would be over now, so she could go back to when everything was normal. The house was built for several generations living under the same roof, so everything was oversized for the tiny woman living alone behind its walls. Her mind drifted to Brenda, her oldest goat, who hadn't eaten as much since the big storm. It had been hard to keep the hay dry since the storm. Esther wished she'd moved the hay inside the barn where it was supposed to be instead of stacking it on the outside. But it was too late now. The overflows made the whole yard a single big pond, and the sun had rarely even appeared from behind the gray mass of clouds ever since the storm ended. Esther was worried that the grass wasn't drying properly. She worried Brenda might bloat. The last thing Esther needed was to run after the vet to take care of the goat. The small but steady income she made from selling the milk in the neighborhood was one thing, but really Esther simply felt bad about her animals becoming sick. She in her loneliness considered all dwellers of her yard more as friends than as livestock. When Devon had arrived, she had felt good in the company of humans for the first time in a very long time. Her brother chasing Devon away had already been a painful enough lesson from life. Now she felt her old friend's suffering would be too much to take. She hoped for the best and prayed for a little sunlight to shine over her farm. She looked back wearily to the gray clouds in the sky, and she felt in the bottom of her heart that life for her and for Devon wouldn't be the same now that they'd gotten to know each other. The next day was Sunday. Esther woke as she normally did with the light shining through her window, and shadow curled at the end of her bed. This particular day she saw that the sky was still gray, which made getting out of her warm bed even harder. Lucky you, Shadow. You can get up whenever you wish. Shadow didn't even bat an eye, even though Esther was sure the cat had heard. Knowing that William would be there soon, and that he didn't like to be kept waiting, Esther hurried to take care of the animals. After she did that, she hurried back upstairs to dress. She always saved her best dress for the Sunday gatherings. On Sunday mornings, everything was done in double quick time, even though she felt slow and clumsy. She pushed herself onward, cleaned her boots, and ironed out her dress meticulously. After she had put on her dress and apron, she brushed out her long hair before securing it under her cap. Her thoughts went back to Devon, as she knew she'd see him later that day. Just as she tied her cap strings under her chin, she heard hoofbeats. If she made William wait, she'd hear of nothing else all day. It was times like those that being hard of hearing was a blessing. William had only just pulled his horse to a halt when she closed the front door. The buggy always appeared full, but she managed to squeeze in just the same. Families who lived in the Amish community took turns having the Sunday gatherings at their houses. The community wagon with the benches would arrive early at the house hosting the fortnightly gathering. The men who had driven the wagon there would help the family to move their furniture out of the house to make way for the long wooden benches. Today, when they arrived at the house where the meeting was to be held, Esther couldn't stop herself looking around for Devon. She made her way into the house and took up her usual place in the very back row. It was then that she noticed that Devon was already inside, sitting on the other side of the room and looking right at her. The world froze for a moment. Esther didn't know how to react. She wanted to avoid attention and not have everyone see Devon staring at her. She did want to express her gratitude to Devon, though, for everything he'd done for her and for his work on the house. She looked over towards the door to see that William had just walked in. Nothing escaped William's quick eye, and she was certain that William had noticed where Devon was staring. She closed her eyes, hoping that William would think she was praying. Through the filter of her damaged hearing, she heard faint sounds, the hushed murmur of her brother talking and the giggle of her sister-in-law. She never knew what people were laughing at, and most times she wondered whether they were laughing at her. That was just one of the reasons she avoided company when she had the choice, and one of the reasons she preferred solitude. Her animals didn't care that she was different or damaged, and she communicated with them just fine. After the gathering, when everyone walked out of the house to wait for the meal to be prepared, the children gathered around to sell cookies. The Miller family baked the cookies to raise money for various charities. Esther had a special bond with Josie Miller, a cute 8-year-old with long curly blonde hair and her front teeth missing. She was a bundle of energy, and always ran up to Esther before anyone else. Esther always made sure she had money to buy a cookie from Josie. "This one is a present for you, Esther," Josie shouted to her. Whenever Josie saw Esther, she ran towards her with heartfelt calls, never minding that Esther did not hear so well from a distance. Josie even seemed to enjoy that she could talk loudly to Esther. In fact, the child didn't lower her voice when she got closer to Esther. Esther had figured out that she could hear people if they spoke slowly, clearly, and stood directly in front of her. Esther went to give Josie the money. "No, Esther. This one is a present for you and for you only. Make sure you do not share, I want you to have it all alone," Josie said, jumping around Esther for a moment. William came beside Esther and purchased a cookie from Josie, and then he led Esther away. Esther stayed by his side as he talked to different folk in the community, and then the meal was served. Esther pushed the cookie up her sleeve and ate the meal. Then she saw her parents sitting on a bench at the back of the yard, and she went to talk to them. Before she reached them, she caught a glimpse of Devon. They locked eyes, and as they did, Devon took a bite of a cookie. It had to be one of Josie's cookies. He held the cookie in the air, and gave her a little wink before touching his hat and turning aside. Esther sat with her parents and talked to them for a time. She learned that her father's back was a little better, but they were going to continue living at William's house, as it was easier for her father with no stairs to climb. When the young people were getting ready for the singing, William strode toward them. "Let's go," William said harshly. He looked Esther directly in the eye and nodded toward his buggy as he helped their father to his feet. Sunday night dinner was always at William's house. The whole family came to the dinners, and with William and Blythe's 7 children and her sister Millie's 4 children, there was quite a crowd. A few hours later, Esther sat around the large wooden table in Williams's living room with William's and Millie's families, and with her mother and father. Since Esther could never hear over dinner, she always drifted off into her own world during the meal. The Sunday dinners were never elaborate, as Sunday was a day of rest, and that meant that cooking and preparing food was kept to a minimum. After dinner, the young children played on the floor of the living room. The weather was growing colder, and Esther wanted nothing more than to be home in her warm bed. There was still one working fireplace that warmed the house, even though she wasn't able to use the fireplace in the kitchen. While the women gathered in the kitchen to gossip, the men gravitated to the living room. Esther pulled a shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. Even though it was cold, she wanted to be alone. Sometimes it was good that she couldn't hear. The Sunday gatherings always took their toll on Esther. It wasn't easy being different, and being treated as though she were stupid or else ignored entirely. No one knew how to treat her or behave around her, she was certain of that. Knowing it would be a while before William drove her home, Esther wandered into the darkened yard and found herself in William's orchard. The orchard reminded her of the sounds of cicadas in the summer that she used to hear when she was younger, before her illness. She wondered if they were out tonight, or whether they only made sounds in the daytime. She sat down on an old decaying little bench and hid her hands in the folds of her dress. It was then that she felt the bulge of the cookie she'd placed up her sleeve. She pulled it out and smiled, remembering the toothless laughter of Josie as the child had handed the cookie to her, forcing it into Esther's lap with both her tiny hands. Esther bit into the hard cookie, chewed on the dry but pleasantly flavored gift when she felt something strange. For a second she was sure she tasted paper. She looked down to the cookie in her hand in awe, as she realized that a tiny piece of paper flickered from within it. She took the small longish piece of paper and held it up to the moonlight. There was something written on it, barely but still readable. She walked back to the house and stood on the porch and read the paper by the light coming from within the house. "Meet me at the old mill. 4 o'clock tomorrow, Monday. D." She was shaken. This must be Devon's doing. A shock of pain flew through her mind and chest. How thoughtful, how elaborate was this of Devon. How clever to accomplish something like this. He had to be there when the Sunday cookies were prepared. He had to make sure the message was put into the cake, and somehow cooperate with the little girl to make sure she passed the cookie, that single piece of cookie, exactly to Esther, right under the hawkish eyes of William who had chased him away. Now Josie's joyful enthusiasm and playful violence all made sense. How Josie had clung to her, and Josie had made absolutely sure that the cookie ended up with her and her alone. Esther wiped away her tears and tore the paper into tiny pieces so no one would find it. She had already committed to memory the time and the place where she'd meet Devon. Chapter 9. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Matthew chapter 6 verse 33. When Monday morning came, Esther leapt out of bed, anxious to see Devon later that day. She made her way to cook breakfast on the makeshift stove, then she'd have a cup of coffee to warm her before her morning chores. The sun was already peeping over the horizon, sending a warm glow across the sky. 4 in the afternoon couldn't come quickly enough. Her heart was beating in her throat while she strolled down the old dirt road towards the creek. This side of town was mostly abandoned. Old crumbling homestead sat empty. She knew the ruins of the old mill. There were rumors that it was a haunted place. Although she was a little nervous, she was glad to have a secret meeting with the man she loved and was confident that no one would find them there. The old mill was through the thick trees. Esther saw it in the distance, and had to lift her dress to navigate her way through the shrubbery. And there Devon was, his lean and handsome form standing tall on the rocks, which were once part of the stone wall around the spacious yard of the old mill. He gestured at her with one strong hand, and Esther responded with a wave. Devon strode toward her and took her hand. He led her without saying a thing. He walked around the mysterious old ruin towards the tiny creek, which was once a small river before the explosion further up in the mountains had closed the old trails of the water for good. It was peaceful here. Not even birds nested there in the drying riverside, let alone humans. Maybe the ghosts of the native ancestors submerged their nets into the river that once was, forever looking to catch ghost fishes still drifting in the muddy, rocky riverbed. Then when they were behind the mill, Devon stopped still and turned to her. Esther looked into his eyes and felt his strong arms pull her toward him. She couldn't help but smile, and he smiled back. It was clear now that Devon felt the same about her. Something was happening between them. Still holding her close, he said, "I'm sorry, Esther. I had no right to interfere. I had no idea that this would happen. I didn't think for a moment that William would be upset about you seeing a doctor. I know some folks don't like to see doctors and prefer to use herbs for what ails them, but I don't think herbs will fix a problem like yours." "No. It's all right, Devon. I'm grateful that you care enough to want me to see about my hearing. I didn't know my brother would act so harshly. I should be the one apologizing to you. I want you to know that I will make it up to you. I'm not giving up on you. I will help you in any way that I can, however I can." Esther had no idea what to say and wondered what he meant by not giving up on her. "Thank you," she said softly, because she thought that she should thank him. "The cookie was a good idea." Devon laughed loudly. "I had to do something. I knew you'd be at the gathering. That's the only time I get to see you. I know how much little Josie likes you. I told her that was the special cookie for you, and I watched to make sure it ended up in your hands." He scratched his chin. "I wanted to avoid you getting into trouble with William. That's a problem that neither of us wants, that's for sure." Esther was annoyed with William for coming between the two of them, but she wanted to keep the conversation light with Devon. It was a perfect ploy. And Josie was so sweet. She made me remember to eat the cookie alone, in such a way that I didn't even realize it. Well, now I'm here, Devon, and I'm glad. I'm glad you're here too. In fact, I want to see you again soon." Esther frowned and looked over the water. "I don't want you to get into trouble with William. I don't want to cross him either. I thought maybe we could figure out how I can see you without him distracting us." Esther sighed because she didn't want to have a secret relationship. "He is overly protective, I'm not sure why." "Not so overly, if they let you live alone in that big house of yours. I don't mean to scare you, but you know yourself how it is. Lots of drifters pass through here, the strangest folks roam these lands sometimes." "I'm doing fine, Devon. But it doesn't mean I wouldn't want to see you again. I have no problem with spending my days alone with my cute little animals." Esther noticed that Devon looked disappointed, so she added, "I do enjoy our talks together." "People aren't meant to live alone, Esther. God meant for a man and a woman to live together." Esther laughed and shook her head. "I'm not like other people, Devon. People make fun of me. They think I'm dumb just because I don't hear them so well. Anyway, I've gotten used to being alone. I don't know if I could be with another person now that I've lived alone, even though it's only been a short time." "You're not so different. You're not different at all. About your brother, I'll have a good talk with him. He's got some business with my father next week, so I'll find him and see if we can come to an agreement about me seeing you. If that's all right with you." "Yeah, I'd like that. I'm sorry that he told you not to finish work on the house just because of me." "It's not the house I'm worried about, Esther, it's you. I know he wants the best for you, and so do I." Esther smiled at him. "Thank you. Well, I should be getting back just in case William is at the house wondering where I've gotten to." Esther turned to go, and Devon stepped forward and held her arm gently. Esther, I'll talk to your brother and I'll explain myself to him. I'm sure he'll allow us to see one another again. Esther nodded, and then left him to hurry back to the house. She was nervous about what their relationship might bring. The more time Devon spent with her, the more chance he'd have of growing impatient with her, just as all her family had done. They made no secret of their impatience, and that's why Esther figured it was easier to be alone. She didn't want things to end up like that with Devon and have him tire of her. Chapter 10. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength, they shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 31. It was a few days on when Esther got the letter to return to the doctor. She hadn't heard from her brother or from Devon. She sat alone in the doctor's office as he explained things to her. Dr. Schaefer had consulted with his colleague, and they were both in agreement that Esther's hearing loss was permanent, and there was nothing they could do apart from aiding her hearing with devices. In her heart, Esther knew that was what he'd say, but she was annoyed that she had allowed herself that glimmer of hope that something might be able to be done. Devon had done that to her. She had been okay with how things were, and she'd been happy and content with her life before he'd come along. Why had Devon given her hope that she might become normal? Esther sat in the chair and watched the doctor's mouth as he prattled on with technical words. She had no idea what he was saying, and neither did she care at that point. She wondered if William was right, and that Devon didn't want her unless she was perfect. Would Devon want a wife who was deaf? Is that why he hadn't been back to see her? Surely Devon would have talked to William by now. Or was Devon waiting on the doctor's findings before he pleaded hard with her brother to see her again? Do you understand all that I've just said? Esther looked from the doctor's mouth up into his eyes. She realized she must have had a glazed-over look on her face. Yes, doctor. I got the main things. There's nothing that can be done. It's the same thing I was told years ago. Well, the same thing my parents were told years ago. Esther walked out of the doctor's office and got into her small buggy and headed home. In a way, she was glad that nothing could be done, as she was never comfortable having people poke instruments in her ears. Now she could be left alone, everyone could leave her alone. Her animals understood her just fine. She had no trouble when she went to town to buy things. Her hearing became a problem only if others confronted her. All the way home, she thought about how strangers generally treated her when they found out she couldn't hear. They treated her as if she were stupid. Her life was settled fine, even now that she needed to stay alone in the house. She missed her parents sometimes badly, but it was indeed nice to run things in her own way. When her house came into view, she saw that William's wagon was outside. She nervously looked around, fearing that Devon might be lurking around as well. The last thing she needed today was to see her brother or Devon. She stopped her horse and saw William near the barn. He walked toward her. Ah, finally. I've been waiting for some time. Sorry, I just felt the need to give Brandy some exercise. He hasn't been out for some time. William patted Brandy on his neck. It's a waste you having him here, since you don't use him to go anywhere. I could pick you up and take you into town every couple weeks if you want me to take Brandy. No, thank you. Brandy and I are doing just fine. William laughed. He was in better spirits than usual, and from that, Esther guessed that Devon hadn't spoken to him. Speaking of brandy, do you have any in that kitchen of yours? You know I don't indulge. A nice cup of tea maybe, she muttered, smiling. No, I'm not staying long. I just brought you some good news. We're going to come to your place for dinner, all of us, on Wednesday night. Now are you happy? He asked. Everyone for dinner? That's right. I know you keep asking for us all to sample your cooking again. I don't think the repairs will be finished by then, will they? Joshua didn't come today. Didn't he tell you? Who? Esther wondered if he might have been speaking of Devon. Joshua? He's finished the job. At least that's what he told me. I'll go in and check on his work. He strode into the house, followed closely by Esther. I know he's finished the front part of the house, but I think he still has to finish the kitchen walls outside. After looking at the kitchen and poking around, William stood up straight and put his hands on his hips. Yeah, all done and a mighty fine job. At last. I'm pleased that I'll be able to cook again. Wednesday night, did you say? She wondered what day Devon might speak to him. It seemed he hadn't talked to him yet because William hadn't mentioned anything. That's right. You tell me what food you want and I'll bring it all over the day before. Thank you, William. It will be so much fun. Esther was pleased that her mother and father would be back in the house that held so many memories for them. She knew it was hard for them to leave it. Millie said she'd come and help you cook too. Just like old times, Esther said with the corners of her mouth tilting upward. Are you sure you don't want tea or maybe coffee? I'm making some for myself, and then I can tell you what I need for the dinner. Coffee then. William pulled out a chair from the kitchen table to make himself comfortable. Then he stood up. I should go and tend to Brandy to save you doing it. Brandy? Esther asked, hoping he was going to unhitch the buggy for her. Yeah, I'll fix him up now. Thank you, William, I'll have your coffee waiting. Esther was pleased to have use of the large fireplace again in the kitchen. She put the kettle on to boil and fetched the cups. Sometimes it was nice to have company, she had to admit that to herself. When the water had boiled, Esther poured 2 cups of coffee and sat waiting at the table until her brother came back. All done, he said as he walked into the kitchen. Thank you, William. When William sat opposite her, she asked, who's going to pay for the work on the house? Well, I couldn't do it because I had, and I've still got repairs to do on my own house. Same with Millie and David. William looked into his coffee. Something will have to be worked out. 2 builders need to be paid, Joshua and Devon. William nodded. Leave all that to me. Now tell me what you need for the dinner. Esther had deliberately brought up Devon's name, hoping to hear that he'd been to speak to William. She was disappointed to learn nothing of Devon. How will we pay them? Esther was worried, and didn't want anyone to go unpaid. The workers had to be paid, but why wasn't William saying how that would happen? He was clearly avoiding her question. Leave it to me, William said through gritted teeth. Esther had learned a long time ago to leave William alone when he spoke angrily as he'd just done. She'd leave the subject alone and then bring it up again soon. Chapter 11. Rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing instant in prayer. Romans chapter 12 verse 12. Esther stretched as she sat up in bed, and as she did, the sunlight flooded into her bedroom. She let out a yawn and ran her hand through her long hair. She smiled a little after thinking of her secret meeting with Devon. Even though William told her not to be around Devon, she was certain that Devon would talk to William and find a way for them to spend time together. But while she thought that she might love Devon, he seemed to have made no moves to speak to William yet. Esther chewed on a fingernail. Did Devon want to keep their relationship a secret, or had he learned that there was nothing that could be done about her hearing? Could the horrible things that William had said about Devon be true? Maybe he was waiting to find out the outcome of the visit to the doctor before he spoke to William. Esther slipped out of bed, put on her robe, and padded out of her room, making her way to the kitchen. She screamed with fright when she saw someone sitting at the kitchen table. She was relieved to see that it was only William. I didn't mean to frighten you, he said. What are you doing here? I told you to keep that door locked. He nodded his head in the direction of the front door. Esther's fingertips flew to her lips. I meant to lock it. I usually do, but since there's been a gaping hole in the kitchen wall, there's not been much point. I must have had something else on my mind. She looked at the papers William had in front of him. What are those papers? I'll have to take that makeshift door away from the bottom of the stairs. It's unsightly. It did its job, Esther said. What are those papers? William suddenly flipped the papers over on the table, glancing up at her. His eyebrows lowered and his forehead creased. She moved closer to him and sat across from him so she could hear exactly what he was about to say. When he didn't answer her, she asked again, What is it? What are you looking at? William pushed the stack of papers further away from her and shook his head. There's nothing you need to worry about, he told her, but the look in his eyes made her grow suspicious. Is it important? She asked, still staring at the papers and trying to read what was written on them. If William was being so secretive about it, it must be important. William nodded, but didn't hand them to her. He kept the papers away from her, then he rolled them up and held them in his fist. His knuckles turned white from the pressure. "You don't need to worry about it, Esther," he told her again. "Just let me deal with it." Esther narrowed her eyes at him, feeling her stomach twist. She had a feeling that there was something wrong, and she lunged across the table to grab the papers. She missed and William yanked them away. Not being one to give up, Esther made another surge forward and the papers flew from his hands, dropping around the kitchen. Scrambling, Esther snatched up a sheet and quickly scanned it, while William scooped up the remaining pieces. She read contract of sale. "William, are you selling this house?" William stood there silently, arranging the papers in his hands. "William," she said again. "Answer me now. Are you selling my home?" William merely shrugged. "You can't get mad at me, Esther. We need the money." "What?" Esther exclaimed. "We're doing just fine. You can't sell the family home." Without a word, he thrust the rest of the papers out to her and she snatched them from his hands, glancing over them with her hands shaking. In William's writing, it was a contract to sell their current house, the one she had lived in her entire life. This was the only house she knew, and now William was selling it. There was no buyer listed, but William had offered the house for sale. Esther felt her heart sink and she suddenly felt nauseous. How could William sell the house? She guessed that having extra money would not hurt them, but he didn't have to sell the house to get that money. "I will have nowhere to live." "Nonsense, there's plenty of room at my house, and Millie said you could stay with her and David." "Millie knows about this?" "We've all decided it," he said. "Since when did I stop being a member of the family? I had no say in it." "You don't bring any money in, Millie and David do. They've got their farm and I've got mine." Esther shook her head, and William didn't even try to defend himself anymore. He just let her glare at the papers. She chewed on her lip and bit down so hard that she tasted blood. She just couldn't get past the idea that he was selling their childhood home. It wasn't a change she wanted to embrace. This was her haven, her place of solitude. She wouldn't feel at home with William or with Millie. Esther ignored William, even after he put a hand on her shoulder to get her attention. "I don't want to talk to you anymore, William," Esther said viciously. "I don't want to talk to you. If you continue with this, I can't speak to you ever again." She didn't want to look at William, who kept tugging on her shoulder. She tore herself away. Suddenly a piece of mail caught her eye and she stopped. The return address was her doctor's office. Esther quickly grabbed the piece of mail in case William saw it. It was probably something important. Hopefully it was good news and the doctor had made some mistake about her hearing. She stuffed the letter up her sleeve and padded out of the kitchen. William had given up trying to get her attention, and sat down at the kitchen table, putting his head in his hands. Esther headed back to her bedroom and slammed the door shut just to show her anger about the house. Sitting down on her bed, she pulled out the letter and tore open the envelope. Her eyes skimmed the letter and she stopped, her hands shaking. She felt her eyes brim with tears and soon enough hot tears spilled down her cheeks. She was reminded how Devon had gone with her to the doctor. The letter was just confirming what she already knew, that there was nothing to be done about her hearing. Why would they write to tell me that when I've already been to see them? It just makes me angrier. I thought it was good news, she mumbled to herself. Esther crumpled the letter in a fit, launched it across the room and buried her face in her hands. There was no way she would ever hear normally again, and right now was the worst time to be reminded of that fact. Suddenly, the words of her brother echoed in her mind, "Devon will never want a deaf wife. You aren't perfect to him. He won't want to marry you unless you can hear." Esther fell back onto her bed and pulled a pillow over her face. How would Devon ever want to be with her? He was the one who had urged her to go to the doctor about her hearing, and he wanted there to be a way for her to be healed, to hear again. How would he respond when she eventually had to tell him that she'd never hear? If Devon felt so strongly about not having a deaf wife, he would certainly drop Esther in a moment's notice. He hadn't even spoken to William, and if he had done so, William would surely have mentioned it. Now that she still couldn't hear, Devon wouldn't want her anymore, and she had no place to live where she could be herself. Things were getting worse for her instead of better. When I met Devon, I was silly enough to think that everything in my life was going to be good, but now everything has gotten much worse. I wish I'd never gotten to know him. Esther felt a vibration rumble through the house. She ran to the window to see that it was William who'd just shut the front door. She heaved her window open and stuck out her head. And you can forget about that dinner on Wednesday night. If anyone shows up here, there won't be anything for them to eat. She yelled as loud as she could and then slammed the window closed. Moira was furious when she found out that her husband and son had decided to sell the house without consulting her. She'd heard that Esther was extremely upset and she didn't blame her. William had convinced his father that the farm would benefit from the added acres that had just come up for sale adjacent to William's land. William had immediately put a deposit on it, signed a contract, and now the time was drawing near to pay for it. William figured that his parents' house could be sold to complete the purchase. Moira sat at the table after Tom and William told her their plans of selling the family home. She clasped her hands together tightly. So why wasn't I asked? She glared at her son and then stared at her husband. That was the house you built for me and where we raised our children, Tom. And we have raised the 3 of them, Tom said, avoiding eye contact with his wife. No, we haven't. We have Esther still living there and she wants to continue living there, doesn't she? Well, she was very upset when I told her about the sale, William said. And who could blame her? Is it because we're women? Is that why we don't have any say in this family? She looked at Tom, and then Tom looked to William as if he hoped William would speak. It's like this, Mom. Esther is living in that huge house by herself when she could easily be living here. We've plenty of room, and I'm building it bigger. If she doesn't want to stay here, she can live with Millie and David. There's no point to her living there at all. It's not bringing us in any money. Money? We're talking about Esther's life. What future does she have? We all know that she'll never marry since she can't bring herself to even talk to a man, so the house is the only security she's got. How can you take that away from her? Tom straightened his shoulders and leaned back a little. Moira dear, a person's security should come from God, not from a house. Easy for you to say, Tom. Since you don't mind where you live. Moira knew she had to be careful not to offend her son. She slowed her breathing, calmed herself, and continued, What I mean is that I wanted to stay in that house and I came here because it was easier for you. I loved that house, and I can understand that since Esther has nothing else she wants to cling to her independence. It's not so much the house, it's her independence that she'd miss. It's been her home, and she's got all the animals there to take care of and her garden. Don't either of you understand that? She looked at both of them in turn. The men looked at each other. William was the first to speak. I don't know what you mean. I can take care of her. I can take care of all of you. You raised me to be this way, so why are you questioning my decisions, Mom? Moira stood up and pounded her fist on the table. No, I will not allow any child of mine to twist my words. Can't either of you see what you're doing to Esther? She doesn't want to live with you, William, and she doesn't want to live with her sister. She wants to be alone and make her own decisions and not live by the mind of others. Moira wanted to scream that neither did she want to live with her son, but she couldn't do that. Tom was perfectly happy to live with William, as other older people lived with their children, but Moira didn't feel old. She was in good health, and mostly in good spirits when the men in the family didn't rile her. And this isn't about God, Tom, like you said before about security coming from God, not from a house. It's nothing to do with that. Still standing, Moira pushed her chair away from behind her and glared at both men before she walked back to her bedroom. Don't go, Mom. We can talk about this reasonably, William yelled after her. Moira ignored her son and closed the door. She leaned against the door and heard Tom say, Leave her to calm down. She'll see that this makes sense in time. Moira flopped onto the bed. No, I won't see that this makes sense because it doesn't. They've no thought to Esther and how she feels. They're treating her as though she were a farm animal to be passed here or there, with no concern to her wishes. Moira stayed in her bedroom and refused to come out for dinner that night. When Tom came to bed, he sat down beside her. I know you have strong feelings about this, but William thinks he's already got a buyer for the house at a good price. The buyer only wants the house on minimal land. He only wants the house and the barn and a few paddocks. The rest of the land we can keep, it's ideal for us. Moira sat up. This is not ideal for us because it's not ideal for Esther. Now Moira, you can't favor one child over the others. I've said this before, you have to treat Esther the same as the other two. Moira pursed her lips. It was true, she did hold a special place in her heart for Esther. Maybe it was the illness that had left Esther damaged, or maybe it was because she saw a determined and independent spirit within her youngest. Hear this, Moira, Esther is not married and never will be. Selling the house will allow us to buy the other land, which will bring in more money for William's family and Millie's family. And there'll be enough farming land for all their children when they get older. So, we sacrifice the happiness of our youngest for the older two and their children? Is that what you're saying, Tom? Tom furrowed his brow. You know that's not what I mean. Moira folded her arms over her chest. It sounds like that to me. This is business, it's a matter of numbers and not a matter of sentiment. We can't eat sentiment, Moira. I'm not stupid, Tom. I can see the benefit of buying the land, and I know that it's good that the man who wants to buy the house is letting us keep most of the land around it. All I'm saying is that there's been little regard for Esther in all this. Esther will get used to living elsewhere. I don't know what all the fuss is about. Moira could see that it was useless. It seemed that Tom had an answer for everything, and it wouldn't matter how long she talked about Esther, or however many ways she tried to explain it, Tom would never see her reasoning. Do you want me to go and talk to Esther in the morning? I'll have William take me over there, Tom asked. No, I'll go and see her alone, Moira said as she slammed her head into the pillow. Chapter 12. For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace, and not of evil, to give you an expected end. Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 11. The next morning, Tom insisted on going with Moira to see their youngest daughter. As Moira and Tom traveled in the buggy, Moira knew that she would have to convince Esther that moving out of the home was the best thing for her, even though Moira knew her daughter would be happier staying on in the house where she'd grown up. Moira had wished that Tom had stayed at home, but still she was certain that Esther would be pleased to see her father. Moira pulled the buggy up as close to the house as she could, so Tom wouldn't have far to walk, considering every step gave him pain. As Moira tied the horse to the post, she heard the familiar creak of the front door as it opened. She saw Esther step out and wave to her. Esther smiled and walked toward her parents. Tom put out his arms. How's my bumblebee? Esther giggled at the name her father called her. Moira had missed the sound of Esther's laughter just as she missed everything about her daughter. It's nice you got away from William to visit me. Tom laughed. He hasn't got us in a prison. I would feel it's a prison if I have to live there. Let's go inside and talk, Moira said. Once they were all sitting on the couch with tea in front of them, Moira said, I've been thinking that I could build myself a house somewhere. Tom chuckled. You don't know the first thing. I've seen you hold a hammer and you haven't got it in you. Moira pursed her lips and frowned. William's extending his house soon, so it'll be bigger, and I'm certain you'll grow to like it if you just try. I don't have any choice, it seems, Esther said. I wish I was born a man. Then I could run my own life and build my own house. Shadow walked into the room and meowed. What about my animals? She asked her parents. You can bring them with you, Tom said. It's only the house that's being sold. Esther shook her head. It's just so easy for everyone to say, but that's because no one understands. We do. We do understand, Esther. How could you let it happen, Mom? Esther, no one likes change, but then we get used to it and find out that it's not as bad as we thought. There will be advantages. William's children do most of the chores, and you can help Blythe and me in the kitchen. Esther breathed out heavily. She preferred to feed and care for animals rather than bottling preserves or baking bread. Moira saw the look of distress still on her daughter's face. It'll be different, but don't make such a fuss. She had to snap Esther out of feeling sorry for herself. Besides, we'll be together and see each other every day. Yeah, it will be good to see you and Dad every day. I've missed you both. See. It won't be so bad. Esther nodded and stroked Shadow, who had just jumped onto her lap. I guess I should be glad that I can take Shadow and Max. And all the other animals, her father added. Moira put the hot cup of liquid up to her lips and took a dainty sip. Your mother and I don't want you to be upset about this. When you're at William's house, we can better keep an eye on you, Tom said. Dad, I'm old enough to be married with children. Jessie Hostetler is my age, and she has 5 children and another on the way. Esther eyed both parents. I suppose it's because I'm deaf and she's not. Esther picked up Shadow, placed the animal on the lounge, and then leapt to her feet. Being hard of hearing is not a problem to me. It seems it's a problem to everyone else. Well, I'm sick and tired of being such a bother to everyone. Esther ran outside. Moira looked at her husband. You made a fine mess of that. What did I say? Tom pushed his bottom lip out. You were prattling on about us keeping an eye on her. She's a grown woman, Tom. We're all treating her like a child or someone who's sick, and she's not a child and she's not sick. She won't break. Tom took a bit of cake and chewed it thoroughly. Yeah, but we're trying to make her feel better about selling the house. I thought that was a good thing to say. Moira shook her head. Now we've upset her even more. I'm going to speak to William and see if he'll build her a small house instead of doing his extensions. I see no reason for her to live alone. Tom sniffed and rubbed his nose. It's what she wants, Tom. I'm a practical man, and I don't see that what you're saying is practical. She'll get used to living at William's house. She can also go to Millie's if she prefers. Moira opened her mouth to protest, but Tom raised his hand up to stop her. You've spoiled her. I have not. You wanted another child when you thought your time was over for it, and you were so happy that God gave you another that she could do no wrong in your eyes. That's not so. I gave her the same discipline as I gave the others. When she got sick, you treated her as a baby. She was sick, what was I to do? No, Moira, I'm talking about when she got better. Moira sniffed and blinked to keep away the tears that threatened behind her eyes. I've only ever done what I thought was best. Tom put an arm around her shoulder and pulled her close. We all do what we think is best. Sometimes tough decisions need to be made, and those tough decisions aren't always going to be popular ones. Moira always felt better in Tom's arms, but Esther had no one's arms in which to feel better. Do you want me to go out and talk to her? Moira sniffed and nodded her head. Tom gave Moira a quick kiss, then pushed himself off the couch and went to find Esther. Esther saw her father staggering toward the barn where Max was comforting her. I'm in here, Dad. Her father caught sight of her and changed direction to head to her. Mind if I join you? He asked as he lowered himself onto a bale of hay. Esther nodded. I know what you're going to say, Dad. You do? She nodded again. There's no point saying anything. I know there's nothing that can be done. I'll get used to things, I suppose. I just hate to leave the house. How can you leave it, Dad? What about all the stories you and Mom used to tell me about how you built it for her, and all the special memories you've got of it? He stared into her eyes. She could see that he still had those feelings about the house. Everything in this world is temporary. Nothing lasts, not you, not me, and not your mother. Someday everything will be gone. We should set our minds on the things of God and not the things of this world. The things of this world will pass away, but the kingdom of God is forever. Tears came to Esther's eyes. She caught on to most of what her father had said. He was right, and she knew at that moment that he loved the house as much as she did. He was setting his sights on his heavenly house and not his earthly house. Not you too. I just left your mother crying in the house. Well, everyone says I take after her. Esther laughed and wiped her eyes with her sleeve. Tom chuckled. That you do. You are very much like her. Esther stood up. Let's go back inside the house. I'm going to enjoy the last of the days I've got here. Mind helping an old man? Tom said, stretching out his hand. Chapter 13. Now the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, that ye may abound in hope, through the power of the Holy Ghost. Romans chapter 15 verse 13. Esther stretched as she sat up in bed, the sunlight flooding into her bedroom telling her that another day waited. She let out a yawn and ran her hand through her long hair as she did every morning. After she ate breakfast and changed into her workday clothes, she opened the door to tend to her usual chores. She nearly stepped on a large rock that hadn't been there the day before. She picked up the rock to move it out of the way, and then she found that a note had been placed under it. It was from Devon saying that he wanted to meet her by the old mill. Esther studied the note as she nibbled on the end of her fingernail. Was it to give her good news or bad news? She'd had enough bad news. In the note, Devon had asked to meet her at noon. She pushed the scrap of paper into the sleeve of her dress and hurried to do the milking. She'd know soon enough what he had to say. Esther knew she should eat before going to the mill, but she couldn't force anything down. She tied the laces of her boots tightly, as they always had a way of undoing. The worst thing she could imagine would be walking up to Devon and tripping over her own laces. She took off walking at a fast pace. Her heart raced at the thought of seeing him again, and she hoped that he felt the same. He had to be still interested in her to plant that note near her front door. She reached the brick wall of the mill and looked around for him, and couldn't see him anywhere. She walked closer to the stream, and it was then that she saw him. He was resting against a tree, the outline of his body strong and lean as he gazed at the water. He turned his head and saw her. "I thought that you weren't going to come." Esther scrunched her nose as she couldn't quite hear him. She smiled, and when she got closer she said, "What did you say?" "I thought you weren't going to come. I got to thinking that you might not have seen the note, or that someone else had found it." "No. I found it." He smiled at her and pushed out both his hands toward her. She placed her hands in his, and he drew her towards him. Esther closed her eyes and smiled as she breathed in his scent and felt how hard his chest was. He released his grip and she stepped back. She thought it best to tell him about her hearing as soon as she could. "My hearing can't be fixed. I met with the doctor a few days ago, and he told me that there was nothing that could be done. The damage is there to stay." She held her breath and examined his face to see what he really thought. She'd found that people could tell you anything, but it's the eyes that tell the truth. The eyes don't try to avoid hurting someone's feelings. "I'm sorry, Esther." He put both hands on her shoulders and looked directly into her eyes. Yes, his eyes said sorry. That was true enough. Was he sorry for her, or was he sorry that it would mean he wasn't interested in her? She couldn't tell, so she pushed a little. "So am I. I'm sorry that I'm always going to have something wrong with me, and I won't be perfect." Devon chuckled. "None of us is perfect, and if we were, I dare say it would be a boring old world." Esther pressed her lips together and took further stock of his eyes to see if he really meant what he said. "You don't mind?" she asked after a moment's silence. What she really wanted to ask is whether they could still have a relationship that could lead to marriage. "I'm just concerned for you. I hope that I didn't get your hopes up, but I thought that the doctors might have made some kind of advancement since your last visit to a doctor. I was wrong." She was still none the wiser, but she tried not to let him see that she was tense. Why couldn't he just come out and say that it didn't matter that she was deaf? Sure, it wouldn't matter if they were just friends, but she wanted more than that with him. "Did you speak to William?" "Yeah, I spoke to William about a few things." "Good. Like what?" "I'll keep that to myself for the moment." Esther frowned at him. She didn't like the sound of that at all. "Well, did you work things out with him the way that you wanted?" Devon took a couple of steps back from her and faced the water. "William and I spoke on quite a few matters, and you were included in what we spoke about." Esther walked a few paces and stood in front of him. "I can't hear you unless you look at me when you're speaking." He looked down, and when he looked up at her he repeated what he just said. Then he added, "I don't want to keep meeting you in secret. William doesn't know we've been meeting like this, and I dare say he wouldn't be happy about us sneaking around. I'm not happy about it either. We'll have to continue to see each other like this though, at least for a while." She smiled, sure she had her answer. "Is that what you want?" She had missed a few words of what he'd said, but she'd got the main bits. "Of course that's what I want, Esther." He placed both hands lightly on her shoulders. "Let's forget everyone else for a moment and concentrate on us." Esther nodded. "Okay." He slid one hand down her arm and clasped his fingers in hers. "Let's go for a walk," he said. They walked along the water's edge, and Esther felt that if the world knew about their relationship, then this would have been a perfect day. The spring sun was warm on her skin, the air was crisp, and everything seemed brighter. "How are your folks liking it at Williams?" Esther shrugged. "They seem okay about it, but I know that Mom would prefer to stay at our house. She has to be with Dad though, and it's better for him at William's. Remind me not to get old, Devon said with a laugh. Why? Because you have to rely on others? That was the position that Esther felt she was in. At her age she should be independent, or at least married. Instead she was under William's control. Well, yeah. And you can't do the things you used to do. It has to happen though. How are your family? They've not been too well. Mom's in bed sick today, and the little ones aren't too good either. What's wrong with them? It started by them not being hungry, and then they had no energy. I was looking after them, but I left you the note and I had to come and see you. No, Devon. You must go home and see if they're okay. Dad's there, they're not on their own. Esther's eyes grew wide. No, you go now. You can see me anytime. He leaned in and whispered, that depends on William. Esther shook her head. Just go, Devon, and come and see me when they're better. He leaned forward, pulled her a little closer to him, and pressed his soft lips against her forehead. Then he stared into her eyes. I'll see you soon. Esther smiled back at him, even though her heart was pounding hard inside her chest. She watched him walk away. Chapter 14. Fear thou not, for I am with thee, be not dismayed. For I am thy God, I will strengthen thee. Yea, I will help thee, yea. I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness. Isaiah chapter 41 verse 10. It was 2 days later that William came to Esther's house with news. One piece of news was that yellow fever had broken out in the town. Someone had died from it, and many had taken ill. He went on to tell her that he had a buyer for the house. Hey, William said too faintly for Esther to hear. Esther stayed silent and traced her fingers in the grooves of the wooden dining table. You should go to town and see if the doctors need help, William said more loudly. Esther stared at him. I don't know. Yellow fever is something you've already had, William went on. You don't have the chance to get it again, so the nurses and doctors could use your help. They're probably already short on staff. When you had it, it raced through the town like a fire. Esther shrugged again. I don't know. Maybe. William nodded intently and said something, probably something about how she should go. She couldn't see his lips from where she was. Esther made herself a small breakfast and focused on chewing. She felt nauseous, but she knew she needed to eat. She was so focused on other things that she didn't register the taste, only the feeling of her food going down her throat. She'd hoped that Devon would have been to see her before now. He'd cuddled her and kissed her on the forehead, and now nothing. After breakfast, Esther retired to her room to change clothes, and she brushed out her hair before winding it and securing it under her prayer cap. Should she go into town and help out? William was right. She had a low chance of getting yellow fever twice. She should help those in need, but then again, she hadn't been out of the house in a long time. She wasn't sure how she'd deal with being around strangers. Apart from getting things from the store every few weeks, she was only used to being around her family, and the people who attended the small Amish gatherings they had every second Sunday. The last time Esther had been in town, people had stared at her, and she knew that they had been saying things about her. She was glad that she couldn't hear them. Is that how it would be today if she went into town? Could she handle people talking about her or staring at her, calling her stupid and rolling their eyes? She decided she shouldn't care what people had to say. The important thing was the people who were sick. They were the ones who needed her help. With that, Esther stood and smoothed out her dress. She left her bedroom, and when she went downstairs, William was still sitting at the kitchen table. I'll go and see if the doctor needs my help, Esther announced. If you need me, I'll be in town. William said, good idea. I'll go home soon, I've got a few things to tend to around here first. Esther stepped out of the house and stood for a moment on the porch just to soak things in. Her house was going to be sold soon, and she would never be able to stand on the porch like this again. Just thinking about having to leave the house deflated her confidence, and she almost considered not going into town. No, there are people who need my help, she thought. I can't get yellow fever again. I hope not anyway, so I need to use that. Esther shook her head and stepped off the porch, making her way down the walkway. The town was a mile's walk from her house. She had thought that William might offer to drive her in his wagon, but he hadn't. Normally she would have taken the buggy, but today she preferred the long walk to give her time to think what she would do when she could no longer live in the house. The more she walked, the more she thought about Devon, and how much she wanted to see him and look into the softness of his eyes again. Just the thought of him not coming to see her brought tears to her eyes. She loved him, but if she lost his friendship as well as his love, she didn't know how she could ever recover. She wished that she'd never met him only to lose him. Life was cruel to her, first the hearing loss and now the loss of Devon, the one man she could have married. He was the greatest thing in her life and she didn't want to lose him. Maybe he was busy, or maybe his family had gotten the fever. Esther bit her lip. If Devon's family had the fever, then William would have learned of it. She was always thinking the worst. The town was almost empty, possibly because people were tucked in bed with yellow fever. She headed past empty shops and walked into the doctor's office, where dozens of people were sitting in the waiting room. Nurses were scattered around the room, trying to attend to patients one by one. People had their mouths open, coughing, and one woman was lying on the ground waiting to see the doctor. Esther couldn't hear any of it. Yes, there was a dull roar overall, but she couldn't make out any specific words or conversations. For the first time in a while, no one was staring at her. No one was looking at her and whispering to others. People noticed her, but it didn't make her feel uncomfortable. Esther suddenly felt confident, and it was a great feeling. Moving through the waiting room, Esther approached the front counter and a nurse greeted her. "Hello," Esther said shyly. "I'd like to help out if I can. I have already had yellow fever, so there's no chance of me getting it again. I can help people without catching it." The nurse's face lighted up with excitement, and she stood up from her desk, ushering Esther into the back room. The nurse took her deeper within the building, to a set of rooms where doctors and nurses were treating patients. Before long, Esther was helping out in any way she could, observing how the doctor moved and what they were doing to treat people. In the process, she met people she had never seen before. She heard parts of conversations as nurses came in and out the room. For the most part, Esther waited for orders from either the doctor or the nurses, and was quick to follow their instructions. Occasionally, she handed the doctors and the nurses instruments and tissues, along with cups of water and food from the office's kitchen. She observed what they did and how they tended to patients. As nurses took breaks to rest, Esther stepped in and tended to their patients once she felt confident in what she was doing. For once, Esther felt like she was actually doing a good job, like her work was actually appreciated. Thank goodness she had once had yellow fever, or else she wouldn't be able to help now. Not once during the day did anyone stare at her and make fun of her for being deaf. For once, she actually felt like a normal person. After so many hours of being at the surgery, a nurse told her she should go home and get some rest. "Would you be able to come back and help tomorrow?" the nurse asked. "Yes, I can," Esther said. "You've been such a help to all of us today. We need all the help we can get at times like these. I've seen it before. If this fever is not contained, it'll sweep through the whole area. We need to keep as many people as we can contained within their houses. We're going to organize that to happen. I'll help in whatever way I can." The nurse gave her a huge smile and then turned to go back to the doctor. Esther walked out the door, straightening her apron and her prayer cap. She left the doctor's office feeling pleased that she'd been useful. Esther spent the entire weary walk home with a smile on her face. When she got there, she was surprised to see William there, almost in the same position he had been in when Esther left that morning. "I enjoyed helping out the doctors and nurses today," Esther said as she sat down at the table. "I think I helped a lot of people." William merely nodded. "I'm proud of you, Esther. You're always so gentle with people." Esther appreciated that William had made the effort to speak clearly. "Maybe," Esther said. "I mean, I know my hearing could possibly get in the way of helping others sometimes, but I do like to take care of people." William nodded again. Esther smiled a little and let silence fill the space between them. She stared at the grooves in the wooden table again and traced her fingertip over it, feeling it against her skin. "Are you going to tell me who you are going to sell the house to?" she asked, suddenly changing the mood of the conversation. She rested her hands flat on the table and stared at her brother. William shook his head. "It's sold today, the contracts are signed, but they don't take possession for a few weeks." It doesn't matter who it was. Esther jumped to her feet, the peace in her heart giving way to panic. You what? Did you say you sold it today? William frowned and let out a sigh. Mom and Dad even told you it had to be done. It wasn't just my idea. Who did you sell it to? He shook his head. What does it matter? It does matter, she said after reading his lips. Tell me. You don't need to worry about it, Esther, he insisted. At least not until you move out. You'll see who it is then. Can't I know now? She demanded. William stood up from the table. You don't need to worry about it right now, Esther. It should be the least of your concerns. Just focus on packing and getting ready. A couple more weeks and then the new owner will move in. Esther let out a sigh of exhaustion and slammed her fists against the table. William put his still full plate on the kitchen counter and left the house. As he brushed past her, Esther sank into a chair. Seconds later, she could feel from the vibration under her feet, and knew that William had shut the door harshly. He must have been waiting to let me know the house was sold today, she thought. Esther didn't even want to think about moving in with one of her siblings. Maybe she could live somewhere on her own. As she went about her end-of-the-day chores, she tried to figure things out. Max suddenly ran from her, and Esther looked up to see him running up the road to meet a buggy. Must be someone we know then, or else Max has completely forgotten how to be a watchdog, she thought. Esther didn't have long to wait. In a matter of minutes, the driver was waving at her. It was William back again. Esther, hurry. William? Everything okay? You're frantic. Esther ran to greet her brother. I've been sent to ask you if you'll help Devon's mother. She's got 6 young ones and she's come down with the fever. The whole family is sick with it. Everyone save for Devon. It's yellow fever, Esther, yellow fever. They need you, the little ones are so sick, and Nellie Hirschberger can't care for them all. Esther brought both hands up to cover her mouth as she gasped at the news. Devon had said they'd been sick. She'd been right when she thought that they might have yellow fever, yet she'd pushed that notion right out of her mind. Esther didn't waste any more time. Will you feed the animals if I'm gone for days? They said at the doctor's that they were going to contain everyone affected in their houses. Yeah, jump in, William said. Esther glanced back at her house as William drove her toward Devon's house. Her dog and cat would wonder where she was, and her cat wouldn't be able to curl up by the fire tonight. The trip to the Hirschbergers' house was spent with Esther giving William a list of instructions. He was to leave a window ajar so the cat could come in and out. He was to leave the barn door open so Max could go in and sleep, and a host of other instructions regarding feeding and watering the other animals. Chapter 15. And now abide it faith, hope, charity, these 3, but the greatest of these is charity. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 verse 13. While they drove forward in the buggy and after Esther had given William instructions for the animals, Esther remembered the excitement a couple years back surrounding the Hirschbergers' arrival into the area. The population of children in the one-room schoolhouse had doubled overnight. Devon was the oldest, being a little older than Esther, and his siblings were much younger. Esther guessed they ranged in age from 5 to 12. The boys were brown-eyed and handsome, and so were the girls, and they were always quick to have a laugh. They had made friends quickly and integrated within the community in no time at all. Even now, with the sun shining on the quiet buggy, it was a stark contrast to the gray mood she felt seeping into her at the thought of the Hirschberger family with the same illness that had robbed her of her hearing. The roadside was blanketed in shades of fresh green, a sure sign that spring was close, but there was still the last nip of winter in the air, and she pulled her black shawl close around her to stay warm. Esther thought back to the first time she'd seen Devon. She couldn't remember him ever speaking to her or to any of the girls. He had a gentle quietness about him that had made her take notice at the time. Esther grabbed the side of the buggy as its wheels slipped in the dirt road, which was now riddled with mud holes. Easy, boy, William said to his horse, who appeared to be distressed. William had a way with horses. Nearly there, boy. Again the buggy slipped, but the horse trotted steadily along after the buggy righted itself. It's hard to see these holes in the wet road, William told Esther. Should we go slower? Esther would rather go slowly. All that rocking to and fro was unsettling her tummy. If we go slow, we might never get through. What? William faced Esther and said loudly, "We'll get bogged if we go slow, and I don't fancy getting out and pushing the buggy out of a hole." Just then the wagon swerved and came to a sudden stop, and Esther was thrown completely from the buggy. She had landed with her belly flat to the ground, her hands breaking her fall. A quick survey of her aches and pains told Esther that she hadn't broken anything. She called out to William, when she noticed that the buggy was on the other side of the road with no sign of William. "He's fine," a loud voice boomed from behind her. Esther turned to see Devon, who was rushing toward her. He put 2 arms around her waist and pulled her to her feet. Still worried about William, she looked over to the buggy to see him with the horse. "You okay, Esther?" William called. "She's fine," Devon answered for her. Then he whispered, "You are okay, aren't you?" Esther smiled and nodded. The sun shone from behind Devon, illuminating him in a warm glow of sunshine, making him look like a proper rescuer. She was safe now that he had his arms around her. He stepped back and dropped his arms. "Thank you, Devon. William was just taking me to your house to help your family. Should you be out of the house? They said they were containing people in their houses so the illness wouldn't spread." "I don't know. I was just getting supplies in case they told me I couldn't leave." Esther looked over his shoulder and saw his wagon. "Thank you." She looked down when she realized she had already thanked him, and she felt the heat rising in her cheeks. She knew she was blushing and she couldn't walk away from him. "Quite a spill you took, Esther. Are you sure you're all right?" "Oh, I'm fine, I think." Esther shook her dress, trying to dislodge some of the mud, but realized it was hopeless. She looked across at William, who was doing something to the horse and buggy. Looking back up at Devon, she said, "William said your whole family is ill." "Dad and I are okay, it's Mom and the children." "I'm glad to hear that it's not all of you. I've come to help because, as you know, I've had the fever before, so I'm told it's unlikely I'll get it again, but other people might catch it." "You came to help us? Really? I'm touched that you'd do that for us." "Why wouldn't I? I helped out at the hospital too, and I was going back there today when I heard your family needed help. It was William who told me." Devon turned to William and called out, "Thank you for allowing Esther to help my family." "We all help each other where we can, Devon." Devon nodded and turned back to Esther. "Your brother's a good man." Esther smiled. "I know he is." Devon turned back to William. "Do you need help?" "No, my horse got spooked, but he's okay now. Nothing appears to be damaged. Why don't I take Esther onto my place? No point you going and exposing yourself to the fever." "Thank you, Devon. I'd appreciate that." Devon turned back to Esther and explained that she would travel the rest of the way with him, and William would go home. Esther waved goodbye to William and then got into Devon's wagon. "Mom will sure be glad to see you. She's having a tough time keeping up with everything right now with the little ones sick." Esther kept quiet and stared at the road ahead. She was right to live alone and not get close to anyone. She'd gotten close to Devon, and that had clearly been a huge mistake since she had no control over how things would turn out between them. "Are you sure you want to come to the house? I can take you home. It's just that yellow fever is so contagious, I'd hate for you to catch it again." Esther smiled and nodded. "I want to help your family. I know you would help mine if our roles were reversed." They rode the last few miles together, talking about the last few years and Devon's family. It was the most Esther had ever heard Devon say. Esther pushed the questions about their relationship out of her mind, and concentrated on the fact that she was helping people, and that's why God had spared her, she was certain. She could have died from yellow fever, but instead God had allowed her to live so she could be of help to others. If Devon truly loved her, he'd make it known soon enough, and if not, she'd just have to forget him. When they rode up to the Hirschberger house, Devon helped her down from the wagon. Mr. Hirschberger came out to greet her. "Esther, you've come to help us?" Esther couldn't understand what he was saying, and she looked at Devon. "My father asked if you have come to help us." Esther turned back to Devon's father. "Yeah, Mr. Hirschberger, in whatever way I can. I've had the yellow fever before." "Thank you, Esther." Esther smiled and nodded as Mr. Hirschberger led her into the house. Before she took too many steps, Devon caught her by her arm and said loudly, "I'll be in soon, Esther. I'm just going to tend to the horses." Esther continued inside the house and found Mrs. Hirschberger lying on the couch. "I'm so glad you've come, Esther." "Thank you. I'm happy to be able to help." "Where are the children?" "They're upstairs in their bedrooms, but they aren't sleeping." Mrs. Hirschberger began to whimper. "I can't keep up with the washing, no one is getting any rest, and the animals need care and, oh, listen to me rattling on and you covered in mud. Matthew, go and get Esther some towels and show her where she can clean up. Did you bring clothes?" "I came too suddenly to bring anything." "Matthew, show Esther where my clothes are too." "Come with me," Mr. Hirschberger said. When Esther was clean and changed, the rest of her day was spent mopping tiny foreheads with cold cloths, spooning water and chicken broth into small mouths through cracked lips, and occasionally looking around for another glimpse of Devon. At night she cooked the family dinner, but only Devon and his father were well enough to sit up and eat at the table. Chapter 16. For we are saved by hope, but hope that is seen is not hope, for what a man seeth why doth he yet hope for? Romans chapter 8 verse 24. By the end of a full week with the Hirschbergers, Esther was worn out. She was almost thankful Devon had left early that day and hadn't seen her covered in spilled broth, soaked in water from wringing out damp cloths and bone-tired. She'd never felt more unattractive, but at the same time she'd never felt so happy. It was truly a blessing, she felt, to give to others in need, and the Hirschberger family desperately needed her. The doctor had been to see them just before Esther had arrived. Now he'd come back and given them the all clear. The children were starting to tease one another and eat solid food, which told Esther too that they were on the mend. Even Mrs. Hirschberger was back on her feet. "You should go home and get some rest, you look exhausted. I'll have Devon take you home tonight." "Are you sure you'll be all right?" Mrs. Hirschberger smiled. "We've kept you long enough. You should go home and have a rest yourself. You're looking tired." Esther looked down at the borrowed clothes she'd been wearing. "I'll wash all of your clothes and bring them back as soon as I can." "No rush. I have many dresses." Esther went upstairs to say goodbye to the children. They had grown used to her company and didn't want her to go. When Esther came back downstairs, Devon was sitting across from his mother. He looked up and smiled at her. "Mom says that I'm to take you home." "Yeah, if that's okay." "No, it's not. I've grown used to seeing you every day." Esther gave a giggle. He had caught on to using some signing, pointing to his eye and pointing to himself and then to her. She also considered him brave for saying such a thing in front of his mother. She looked at Mrs. Hirschberger, who didn't seem to mind Devon saying such a thing. "Well, have you got everything?" Devon asked as he rose to his feet. "I came with nothing, remember?" "Come on then." He walked toward the front door. Esther said goodbye to Mrs. Hirschberger and hurried out of the house to catch up to Devon. He helped her into his wagon. The first few minutes of the journey back to her home were spent in silence. Esther had grown used to the bustling family life of the Hirschbergers' home, and wasn't sure that she wanted to go back to living her life alone. "You're quiet," Devon said. "And so are you," Esther replied. They both smiled at each other. "I was just thinking that I'll miss you," Devon confessed. Esther nodded. He grabbed Esther's arm to get her attention, and as she looked at him he said, "I do think that William will be okay with us seeing each other now." "You think so?" Esther frowned, wondering if they'd talk. "He'll have to be all right with it." When they arrived at Esther's house, William was there feeding the animals. When the wagon stopped, Esther jumped down, raced to William, and asked him many questions about her animals and how he'd coped with them. Max ran to her, barking and running in circles. William answered all her questions, and then told her he wanted a private word with Devon. Esther stayed away from the two of them as they talked. She couldn't hear them, and was too far away to read the words their lips were forming. She saw them shake hands, and then Devon climbed up into his wagon. He looked over at Esther and waved. Esther lifted a hand and waved back, sad that they wouldn't have a private moment to talk about where and when they'd meet again. Maybe William had told him that he still didn't want them to see each other. When Devon was a safe distance away, Esther rushed to William. "What did you two talk about?" "Nothing much." "Well, I'm glad the Hirschbergers are all better now." "Yeah, so am I." "Do you want to stay here the night or come back home with me?" William asked. No, I'll stay here. This is where I belong. You won't be here much longer, Esther. I don't want to upset you, but you'll be living with me and my family soon. That was the last thing Esther wanted to hear. She'd find a way to live on her own, even if she had to erect a tent. Shadow and Max would have to reconcile their differences because she would have to take them with her. William drove his buggy back down the dirt road and Esther stood and watched him go. She hadn't felt this alone before, not even when her parents left. With a sad heart she walked toward her house. She opened her front door and it wasn't long before her cat greeted her with a loud yowl. That night she prepared to slip into sweet dreams of a ruggedly handsome neighbor with beautiful eyes, and a smile that warmed her. Chapter 17. The hope of the righteous shall be gladness, but the expectation of the wicked shall perish. Proverbs chapter 10 verse 28. Esther knew she had to come to terms with leaving her house. The repairs had been finished, and now the buyer was set to come to the house. Esther had hoped this day would never come. That very morning she'd found another note from Devon that said she was supposed to meet him late that afternoon, but how could she if she was going to be at William's house? How would she ever get over it? This house was the one she had grown up in, and there was no way she could ever leave it unless she was forced, and that is exactly what her brother was doing. She remembered running around the kitchen as a young girl squealing and laughing. She remembered pulling herself up into a kitchen chair at 9 years old, waiting eagerly for meals. She remembered sitting in her bed and clutching her pillow in fright during every thunderstorm. Esther had formed so many beautiful memories in this house, and she couldn't get over how William could be so selfish and childish to just sell it off. Didn't he know how many of his own memories were in this house as well? Didn't he care? Esther slowed herself down when she was packing her things. She took almost 2 hours to pack her small set of clothes and her bedding into her bag. After she packed everything, she unpacked and repacked just to waste time. She rifled through her closet and her chest of drawers just to make sure that she had packed everything. The last thing she wanted to do was finish packing too early. She wanted to spend as much time in the house as she could before she needed to leave. She would take the cat and the dog in William's buggy, and then the next day William would come and fetch the rest of the livestock to take to his farm. As Esther packed, she kept thinking of Devon. She hadn't told him that William was selling the farm, but now she knew she'd have to talk about it. Somehow, talking about it made it seem more real. Finally, she finished packing her bag and set it on her bed. The room was oddly bare without all of her belongings, and she hated the idea of someone else living in this room. She had spent most of her life here, and she could not imagine living anywhere else. Esther had so many connections with this room, and she didn't want to leave, but William would drag her out if he needed to, she was certain of that. Esther left the bedroom and passed through the empty kitchen. She'd already packed all of her belongings and kitchen items. She'd arranged to meet Devon down at the old mill, then she'd have to hurry back to the house for William, who was coming to fetch her. Esther arrived at the old mill and took a seat in the overgrown grass, letting it tickle her skin. She took a deep breath, taking in the clean air. Off in the distance she saw Devon and she got to her feet. Her heart pounded, and she wanted to run away, just to avoid telling Devon about the house and the fact that she'd be living with her brother, like an old spinster who had no life of her own. She saw his lips move and his voice barely reached her ears. "Hello," she said back, a smile on her lips. But when she thought about the things she would have to tell him, the smile faded. Devon drew her into a tight embrace and pressed his lips to her ear. "What's wrong?" he whispered, holding her closely. "William sold the house," Esther said as tears filled her eyes. "I can't see you anymore because I have to live with William." Devon pulled back and shook his head. Putting his lips by her ear again, he said, "You can still see me." "How? Will William allow it? Is that what you talked about?" Devon sighed and he held her hands in his. "I've told William how I feel about you. I think he can see how much you mean to me." Esther shook her head. She'd had enough drama and didn't want any more. "I want you to be with me forever and always, Esther." Esther felt a smile come to her lips. "Really? I don't want our feelings for each other to be a secret." Her gaze fell to the ground. "You do have feelings for me, don't you, Esther?" Esther felt tears come to her eyes. He really did love her. Then the smile on her face faded. She nodded. The new owner of the house is coming by today, and then I'll be living with William and his family with my parents." "You're not leaving," Devon said with a chuckle. Esther tore away from him. "I have to, Devon. I don't know if I've told you what my house means to me. Anyway, I suppose I'll get used to living with William and Blythe." "When are you going?" "Today. I've got everything packed up. William's coming soon to put everything in the wagon." "Esther, listen to me." Devon cupped her face in his hands and then spoke slowly. "I bought the house from William." Esther put both hands on his chest and pushed him away. "No, you didn't." "I did. I bought the house from William. I'm the new owner." Esther took in a deep breath and covered her mouth with her fingertips. "Are you joking with me now?" He shook his head. "Why did you buy the house?" "Because I want to marry you, Esther," Devon said softly, his eyes watering a little. "I want to be your husband, and I want you to be my wife. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I've never met a woman like you, and I don't want to lose you." He took her hand and said, "Will you marry me?" Esther's hand covered her mouth as she giggled. "Yeah, I'll marry you." Hot tears spilled down her cheeks. She wrapped her arms around his neck and she never wanted to let go. She was holding on to her future husband, the man who actually wanted to be with her. He didn't want to hide their relationship, and he didn't mind that she wasn't perfect. Devon smiled at her. "I bought that house for you because I know how much you love it. I wanted to surprise you with it. I wanted it to be the house where we live out our lives together, Esther." "Is this real?" she asked. He nodded. Esther buried her face in Devon's shoulder, feeling her chest swell with happiness. She was truly happy now. She had gone through a few rough patches, but now she had gotten everything she wanted: the house she grew up in, the love of her life, and absolute happiness. Devon and Esther walked back to the house with Devon's arm about Esther's shoulders. "William's coming soon." Devon said, "No, he isn't. It was what we decided to tell you. I wanted it to be a real surprise." Esther stopped. "You wanted me to think that I had to leave my house?" Devon cringed. "Don't be mad at me, Esther. It wasn't quite like that. William had someone else who was going to buy it, and I heard about it and told William I first wanted to buy it and marry you." Esther giggled. "How long ago did you talk to William?" "Just before my family came down with the fever." He looked at her. "Don't be cross with me, please. I wanted this to be a nice surprise for you." Esther closed her eyes and covered them with her fingers. She had to process all these changes in her mind. She opened her eyes. "All these changes will take some time to get used to. You really want to marry me? And we can live in my house?" "Yeah and yeah. William is happy about us being together too, once I shared with him how I felt about you. I'm sure he thought something different at the start. Why don't we go and see the bishop right now, and then we can announce a wedding date?" Everything had turned out exactly how Esther had wanted. She looked into Devon's eyes and couldn't speak. All she could do was nod. She never expected that she'd get married, even though it was the very thing she wanted most. Devon pulled her into his arms and leaned down and pressed his lips softly against hers. It was in the afternoon that Moira noticed a buggy heading toward William's house. She squinted to see that it was Devon Hirschberger's buggy. Then she saw that her youngest, Esther, was sitting beside him. She stepped back from the window of the living room and shook Tom awake. Tom had dozed off on a chair. "What is it? Is dinner ready?" "No, Tom, there are other things besides food. It's Esther, and she's being driven here by Devon Hirschberger." "Here now?" "They're coming toward the house. And there's only one reason that Devon and Esther would be coming to see us." Tom blinked a few times. "And what's that?" "They're going to tell us they're getting married." "They are?" Moira nodded. "William told me that it was Devon who bought our house." "Is that why he bought it?" Tom asked. "That's why he bought it, and wanted it kept a secret, until he asked Esther to marry him." "How do you know all that?" Tom asked. Moira giggled into her handkerchief. "William told me." Tom rose to his feet. "We'd better go out and meet them." Moira grabbed Tom's arm. "Do you see what this means, Tom?" Tom raised his eyebrows as if waiting for his wife to inform him. Moira continued, "We prayed for God to bless us with just one more child and we thought it would never happen. We had to wait and wait, but God blessed us. Then we nearly lost her and we prayed that God wouldn't take her from us." Tom interrupted, "And then you prayed that she'd find a husband?" Moira's eyebrows flew up. "How did you know?" Tom chuckled. "I know how your mind works, Moira, I always have." Moira smiled and threw her arms around her husband. "I never thought it could ever happen, and such a nice man like Devon. It proves to me that God hears us and answers our prayers. I've always liked Devon and his family." Tom patted Moira's hand. "Come on then. Let's go out and act suitably surprised when they give us their news." Moira smiled and walked out to greet her youngest daughter and her newly betrothed. Thank you for listening to Amish Silence, the final book in the Amish Bride series. If you enjoyed this series, you might enjoy the Amish Romance Secrets series. Book 1 is a simple choice.